Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but what happened that day in Jasper still haunts me nearly 22 years later. I'm Paul. And back in 2002, I experienced something that changed my entire perspective on what's possible in our world. My wife Pamela and I had just moved to Jasper, Arkansas, a small town nestled in the Ozark Mountains. We weren't looking for anything unusual that spring morning. I was just taking my usual walk along an old logging trail that cut through the Wilson property, a peaceful stretch of land owned by an elderly couple who lived in town. The air was crisp that morning, and there was this weird stillness in the woods. You know how sometimes the forest just feels different, like something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's exactly how it felt. I remember checking my watch. It was around 7:30 a.m., and the morning dew was still clinging to the grass. I'd walked this trail maybe 100 times before. It was my morning routine, a way to clear my head before heading to work at the local hardware store. The Wilsons were kind enough to let me use their trail. They barely visited this part of their property anymore due to their age, and Mrs. Wilson always said she liked knowing someone was keeping an eye on things. About a mile into my walk, something stopped me dead in my tracks. There, in a patch of soft earth near the trail's edge, was something I still struggle to explain. 5 perfectly aligned footprints, each one massive, easily 10 inches long. They were pressed deep into the soil, much deeper than any human footprint I'd ever seen. The stride length between them was incredible, far longer than what any person could manage in a normal walk. The detail that really got to me was how fresh they looked. The edges were crisp, undisturbed by wind or weather. These weren't old prints. Whatever made them had passed through recently, probably within the last few hours. The soil was still slightly damp from the morning dew, and there was something unsettling about how methodically they were placed, one after another, in an almost unnaturally straight line. I had my old Nokia flip phone with me. Remember those indestructible things? And I immediately started taking pictures. They weren't great quality. Phone cameras back then were nothing like today, but I needed some kind of proof of what I was seeing. Looking back, I kicked myself for losing those photos when that phone eventually died, but at the time, I never thought they'd become so important to me. What really struck me was the shape. While the toes weren't super distinct in the impressions, the overall form was unmistakably foot-shaped. But these weren't human feet. They were too wide at the ball, too massive overall. And the depth of the impressions, whatever made these, had to be incredibly heavy. As I was examining the prints, the woods around me suddenly went dead quiet. If you've spent any time in nature, you know that's never a good sign. The morning birds that had been chattering away just moments before went completely silent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this overwhelming feeling of being watched. That's when I noticed the smell. It's hard to describe. Kind of like wet dog mixed with something musty and wild, but much stronger. It wasn't like anything I'd encountered in these woods before, and I'd seen plenty of local wildlife. This was different. The odor seemed to get stronger over the course of about 30 seconds, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I heard a branch snap somewhere in the dense undergrowth to my left, maybe 50 yards away. It wasn't the sound of a squirrel or deer. This was something big. Then came this deep, rumbling sound, almost like a growl but lower, more guttural than anything I'd ever heard. It was so low I felt it more than heard it, like it was resonating in my chest. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was terrified. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay still. I remembered reading somewhere that running could trigger a predator's chase instinct. So I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Through the thick foliage, I caught movement. Something large and dark shifted between the trees. The vegetation was too dense to make out any clear shape, but whatever it was had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It moved with an eerie smoothness that seemed impossible for its size. Just a glimpse, a shadow really, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The next few moments felt like hours. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, as whatever it was moved through the undergrowth. There was this weird pattern to its movement. It would stop completely for several seconds, then shift position, stop again, shift again, like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was or what I might do. Then came the most terrifying part. From somewhere deeper in the woods, maybe a few 100 yards away, came a response to that initial growl, another low, rumbling sound, but slightly different in pitch. They were communicating. The realization that there were at least 2 of these things out there nearly made my knees buckle. I started slowly backing away, keeping my eyes fixed on where I'd seen the movement. Each step felt like an eternity. I didn't dare turn my back, didn't dare run, just kept taking slow, deliberate steps backward toward the direction I'd come from. The whole time, that feeling of being watched never left. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes, I'd backed up maybe 50 yards from the footprints. That's when I heard it. A series of heavy footsteps moving away from me, accompanied by the sound of branches being pushed aside. Whatever it was retreating deeper into the woods. I waited until the sounds had faded completely before I finally turned and walked quickly back to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. When I got home, Pamela knew something was wrong the moment she saw my face. I told her everything, and God bless her, she believed me. We went back later that day with a camera, but a sudden spring rain had already started washing away the prints. By the next morning, they were completely gone. I spent months researching after that, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. I found other reports from the Ozarks, similar encounters with large, unknown creatures. Some people mentioned the same details: the complete silence in the woods, that distinctive smell, the deep footprints. But nothing quite matched the methodical, almost intelligent behavior I'd witnessed. The Wilsons sold their property a few years later and moved to be closer to their children. The new owners cleared much of that area for pasture land, and the old logging trail is gone now. Sometimes I drive by there on my way to work, and I always slow down, scanning the tree line. The rational part of my mind tries to explain it away. Maybe it was bears, maybe my fear distorted my perceptions. But then I remember those footprints, so deliberately placed, and that deep, resonating growl that I felt in my bones. I've never gone back to walking those woods alone. Whatever I encountered that morning, it changed something in me. It made me realize that maybe we don't know our world quite as well as we think we do. There are things out there, things that have managed to stay hidden despite all our technology and development. Things that watch us from the shadows of the forest, intelligent enough to stay just out of sight, just beyond the reach of our cameras and scientific instruments. The strangest part: every now and then, usually in the early morning hours when the fog rolls in from the mountains, I catch that same distinct smell on the wind, just for a moment, just long enough to remind me that whatever I encountered that day is still out there, still watching, still waiting in the ancient forests of the Ozarks. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. Those footprints were real. That creature was real. And somewhere out there in the dense forests of Arkansas, they're still there, moving silently through their domain, leaving only the faintest traces of their passage for people like me to stumble upon. Story 2. It started on what seemed like a perfectly normal morning. I'd gotten to my hunting spot well before sunrise, as usual. The air was crisp, not quite freezing, but cold enough that I could see my breath. I remember checking the weather report the night before. Clear skies, no wind to speak of, perfect hunting conditions. My stand was set up in a sweet spot I'd been using for years, overlooking a natural funnel where the deer would often pass through. Around 9 a.m., after sitting quietly for several hours, something caught my eye that just wasn't right. About 30 feet away from my stand, there was this broken branch that I swear hadn't been there the day before. Now, I know what you're thinking. Branches break all the time, right? But this wasn't your typical broken branch. It was thick, about the size of a soda can, and the break was clean, almost deliberate. The weird part? It was snapped at least 10 feet up, way too high for a deer, and we hadn't had any storms recently that could explain it. I'm not someone who spooks easily. 20 years of hunting has taught me to keep my cool, but something about that branch made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just broken, it was twisted, like something had grabbed it and wrenched it with considerable force. I've seen plenty of storm damage and animal markings in my time, but this was different. It looked intentional. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and focus on hunting, but I couldn't stop glancing back at that branch. The morning dragged on, and I didn't see a single deer, unusual for that spot. Even the usual squirrels and birds seemed scarce. The woods were just too quiet. Around noon, I decided to call my brother-in-law Paul on the two-way radio. He was hunting about 100 yards away, near the creek that runs through our hunting grounds. When he answered, his voice was different, tense, almost whispering. "Karen," he said, barely audible, "there's something down here by the creek." I asked him what he meant, and his response made my blood run cold. He described seeing a large black figure walking through the creek bed, not walking like a bear, walking upright, like a person, but much bigger. He said it moved with purpose, taking long strides through the water. I wanted to think he was pulling my leg, but Paul's not the type to joke around while hunting. He's as serious as they come about it. The fear in his voice was real. After that radio call, I couldn't sit still. I kept scanning the trees, jumping at every snap of a twig. Around 2 p.m., I decided I'd had enough. I climbed down from my stand, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my rifle. I needed to see that creek for myself. The walk to the creek was the longest 100 yards of my life. Every step felt wrong, like I was walking into something I shouldn't. The usual forest sounds had returned somewhat, but they felt different, strained, almost like the wildlife was as tense as I was. When I reached the creek, what I found shook me to my core. The creek isn't deep. When I stepped into it, the water only came up to my thighs. But there were these footprints in the muddy bottom, huge, human-like prints, but at least twice the size of my boots, and the spacing between them. Whatever made those prints had a stride length that I couldn't match, even if I jumped. But what really got me was the realization about the creature Paul had seen. If I was standing in the creek, and the water was at my thighs, and Paul had only seen the shoulders and head of whatever walked through here, doing the math made me feel sick. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. I found Paul at his stand, and he was as white as a sheet. We compared notes, and everything added up in the worst possible way. The broken branch at my stand, something that tall could have easily reached it. The foot spacing in the creek matched the height estimate. Even the unusual quiet in the woods made sense. Every animal in the area must have sensed what was walking through their territory. We decided to pack it in early that day. The sun was still up, but neither of us wanted to be in those woods any longer than necessary. As we were walking out, we heard it, a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't a howl or a scream like you hear people describe in Bigfoot stories. It was deeper, more guttural, like something between a tiger's roar and the sound a bull makes when it's angry. But it had this intelligence to it, like it wasn't just an animal noise but something trying to communicate. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. We didn't stick around to hear it again. We practically ran back to our trucks, breaking every rule of careful hunting in our panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more it all fit together in a terrifying way. The broken branch wasn't random vandalism. It was a marker, or maybe a territorial sign. The creature in the creek wasn't just passing through, it was patrolling its territory. And that sound, that was a warning. I've gone back to those woods since then. Had to, really, since the property's been in my family for generations. But I've never hunted from that stand again. I've never seen anything that clear or dramatic since that day, but sometimes, when I'm out there, I'll find another broken branch, way too high up, or I'll notice the woods going quiet in that same unnatural way. And I know, deep down, that whatever I saw that day is still out there. I know how this sounds. Before that day, I would have laughed at anyone telling me a story like this. I was the biggest skeptic you could find when it came to Bigfoot stories. But there's a difference between hearing stories and experiencing something yourself. I can't explain what Paul and I encountered that day, but I know what we saw was real. The broken branch, the footprints, that sound, it all happened. The weirdest part? After that day, things just went back to normal. No more dramatic encounters, no missing livestock, nothing that would make the local news. Just those occasional signs that something's still out there, watching. Sometimes I wonder if that's worse, knowing it's there but never knowing when or if you'll see it again. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that day. Was it really what people call Bigfoot? Some unknown species? Something else entirely? I don't have answers. All I know is that something impossible walked through those woods that day, something that shouldn't exist but does. And every time I hear someone dismiss Bigfoot stories as hoaxes or imagination, I think about that broken branch, those footprints in the creek, and that sound, and I keep my mouth shut. Because some things you just can't explain to people who haven't experienced them themselves. Some things you have to see to believe. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them or go back to thinking about the world the same way again. Story 3. My husband Carl and I bought 40 acres in Mountain View, Arkansas back in 2014. We'd always dreamed of building our own home, and the property was perfect. Lots of trees, a beautiful creek running through it, and enough privacy to feel like we had our own little piece of paradise. The land was mostly undeveloped, just the way we wanted it, with dense forest on 3 sides and a clearing where we planned to build. I still remember that day in October like it was yesterday. The weather had just started to turn cooler and the leaves were beginning to change. We'd been living in our partially finished house for about 3 months at that point. The basic structure was done, walls up, roof on, windows and doors installed, but we still had a lot of interior work to do. We'd decided to move in anyway because our apartment lease was up, and honestly, we were just too excited to wait. That morning started like any other. Carl left for work around 6:30 a.m. He's a contractor and had a job about an hour away. I was working remotely as a graphic designer at the time, so I stayed home. Around 10 a.m., I decided to take a break and walk down to check on our garden near the creek. We'd planted some vegetables there because it was the only spot that got decent sunlight through the tree cover. I was pulling some weeds when I heard something that made me freeze. It was a sound I'd never heard before, like branches breaking, but not the normal kind of breaking you hear when deer walk through. These were big branches, and the sound was accompanied by heavy thuds. Whatever was making that noise was big. I slowly stood up and looked across the creek. The trees were pretty dense over there, but there was enough spacing between them that you could see maybe 30-40 feet in if you really looked. That's when I saw it. Something massive moved between two large oak trees. It wasn't like watching a bear or a deer. This thing was upright. In that split second, all I could process was that it was dark-colored, probably 7-8 feet tall, and it moved with purpose. My heart started racing immediately. I'd grown up in Arkansas, spent plenty of time in the woods, and knew all the local wildlife. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, then turned and walked as quickly as I could back to the house. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything following me. Once inside, I locked all the doors and tried to calm down. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that maybe it was just a bear standing up, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I called Carl, but it went to voicemail. He was probably up on a roof or something. I sent him a text saying I'd seen something weird and to call me when he could. I tried to get back to work, but I kept finding myself staring out the windows. Around 2 p.m., I got up to make some coffee. We have these big sliding glass doors in our kitchen that look out over the back of the property. As I was waiting for the coffee to brew, something caught my eye. There was a weird smudge on the outside of the glass near the top of the door. At first, I thought it was just dirt, or maybe a bird had hit the window. But when I really looked at it, my blood ran cold. It was a handprint, not just one, but 2 of them, about 8 to 9 feet up from the ground. They were huge, way bigger than any human hand, and they were positioned like something had been trying to peer inside. The prints were oily or greasy, leaving distinct marks on the glass. I could make out 3 or 4 fingers and what looked like part of a thumb, but the proportions were all wrong. They were too big, too wide, and the fingers were thick and stubby. I started shaking. Those prints weren't there that morning. I would have noticed them. Whatever I'd seen by the creek had come up to our house while I was inside working. The thought made me feel sick to my stomach. I took some pictures with my phone, my hands trembling so bad I could barely hold it steady. I tried cleaning the prints off, but they were weirdly resistant. The glass cleaner seemed to just smear them around at first. It took several attempts with heavy-duty cleaner to get them off completely. The whole time I was cleaning them, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something was watching me. Carl finally called back around 3:30 p.m. When I told him what happened, he said he'd leave work early and head home. Those 2 hours waiting for him were the longest of my life. I sat in our bedroom with all the doors locked, jumping at every little noise. The woods around our house suddenly felt menacing instead of peaceful. When Carl got home, we walked the property together. We found some broken branches on the other side of the creek, right where I'd seen the figure, but the ground was too hard and leaf-covered to show any prints. Carl took my concerns seriously. He'd grown up hunting in these woods and knew I wasn't the type to make up stories. That night, we heard things moving around outside the house. Not just normal nighttime wood sounds, but heavy footsteps and what sounded like breathing. Carl got his rifle out, but whatever it was stayed in the darkness beyond our porch lights. Around 3 a.m., there was a loud bang on the side of the house that made us both jump. It sounded like something had slapped the wall with an open hand. We didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, Carl installed security cameras and motion sensor lights all around the property. We never got any clear footage of whatever it was, but over the next few weeks, we'd occasionally hear those heavy footsteps at night or find broken branches in places where no person should have been able to reach. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. No more sounds, no more handprints, no more feeling of being watched. It was like whatever it was just moved on. We still live in that house, and we've never had another experience like that October. We've talked about what it could have been, but we've never come up with a satisfying explanation. I've researched similar encounters in the Ozarks, and I know there are stories about large, unidentified creatures in these woods. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or anything specific. Honestly, I don't know what it was. All I know is what I saw that day by the creek, and those handprints on our door were real. They weren't human, and they weren't from any animal I'm familiar with. Sometimes when I'm out in the garden now, I still get that feeling of being watched. I don't know if it's just paranoia, or if whatever visited us that October is still out there somewhere in these woods. Carl installed a heavy-duty fence around the property last year, which helps me feel a bit safer, but I never go outside after dark anymore if I can help it. The weirdest part is how normal everything seems now. We go about our daily lives, work on the house, tend to our garden, but there's always this underlying knowledge that something unexplainable happened here. I catch myself looking up at those sliding glass doors sometimes, half expecting to see those huge handprints again. They never came back, but I'll never forget how they looked that day, so clearly defined, so impossibly large, so undeniably real. I've never shared this story publicly before. Most people would probably think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. But I know what I saw, and those handprints were real. Carl saw them too. We still have the pictures somewhere, though they don't really do justice to how unsettling they were in person. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else in Mountain View has had similar experiences, but like me, has been too afraid of ridicule to talk about it. The land around here is old, and the forests are deep. Maybe there are things out there we don't understand, things that mostly want to be left alone, but occasionally get curious about us. All I know is that I'll never forget that October, and I'll never stop wondering what exactly it was that came to visit us that day. Story 4. It all started on this random Tuesday in March 2015. I remember it was unusually warm for that time of year, and I was doing my usual morning walk around the property to check on things. We'd been having issues with local teens sneaking onto our land and leaving trash behind, so I'd gotten into this habit. I was checking near our storage shed when something caught my eye. At first I thought it was just another piece of trash, but when I got closer I realized it was an old flip phone, one of those Nokia bricks from the early 2000s. What made my skin crawl wasn't just finding the phone, it was the condition it was in. The thing looked like it had been chewed on, with deep teeth marks that were way too big to be from any regular animal I knew. The plastic was all warped and cracked, with these massive indentations that made my stomach turn. I picked it up using a stick. Yeah, I know, probably overcautious, but something about it just felt wrong, and brought it back to show Caitlin. She's usually the skeptical one, but even she got weird vibes from it. We decided to leave it on our back porch table to deal with later. Here's where things get really messed up. The next morning, the phone wasn't where we left it. Instead, we found it about 50 feet away, carefully placed on this old sheet of corrugated metal we'd been meaning to get rid of. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe an animal moved it, right? But here's the thing. It was placed dead center on that metal sheet, perfectly aligned, like someone had deliberately put it there. I'm not usually one to get spooked easily, but this got to me. We decided to leave it there, just to see what would happen. The next day, the phone had moved again, this time to a patch of dead grass near our fire pit. Again, placed with this weird precision that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This went on for about a week, with the phone showing up in different places each morning. But then things escalated. We started finding other objects arranged in similar ways. First, it was this random U-shaped pipe, about 3 feet long. We'd never seen it before, but there it was one morning, standing upright against our shed. The next day, it was laying horizontally across two stumps, like some kind of deliberate display. Then came the trailer button, one of those decorative chrome things you'd see on an old Airstream. Again, not something we owned or had ever seen before. We'd find these objects in different arrangements every morning, always placed with this unsettling precision. One night, around 2 a.m., our motion sensor lights went off. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window, and I swear I saw something move at the edge of the woods. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, this massive, dark shape that seemed to just melt into the shadows. The weird thing was, our dogs, usually quick to bark at anything, were dead silent, just staring out the window with their ears pinned back. The next morning, all three objects, the phone, pipe, and button, were arranged in a perfect triangle on our front lawn, each exactly the same distance apart. I measured it out of curiosity, exactly 6 feet between each item. This wasn't random animal behavior anymore. We started documenting everything with photos. I still have them saved somewhere, but looking at them now, they don't really capture how unsettling it all was. There was this overwhelming feeling of being watched, like whatever was moving these objects was studying our reactions. The weirdest part? Our trail cameras never caught anything. We had 4 of them set up around the property, but every time something moved, we'd check the footage and find nothing but static or completely black frames during those specific time periods. These were brand new cameras with fresh batteries, but they just failed every single time. One morning, I found what looked like footprints near where the objects had been placed. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, but what really got to me was how human-like they were, just massively oversized. They were pressed deep into the soil, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I tried to make a plaster cast, but it rained before I could get it done properly. The activity peaked one night in late March. We were sitting in our living room when we heard this sound, kind of like wood knocking against wood, but much louder than any woodpecker. It was coming from different directions, like there were multiple sources. Then we heard what I can only describe as a low, rumbling vocalization. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite human. It was something in between that made my whole body go cold. That night, we heard heavy footsteps circling our house. Whatever it was big enough that we could feel slight vibrations through the floor. Our dogs were huddled in the corner of our bedroom, shaking. We tried calling the police, but by the time they arrived, everything had gone quiet. The next morning, all the objects were gone. Just gone. We searched the entire property, but never found them. What we did find were these weird arrangements of broken branches stuck into the ground in various places around our property. They looked like markers or territorial signs of some kind. After that night, everything just stopped. No more moved objects, no more sounds, no more footprints. It was like whatever had been visiting us just decided to move on. We still live on the property, but things have never felt quite the same. Every now and then, we'll hear that wood-knocking sound in the distance, but it never gets as close as it did during that month in 2015. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened. Could it have been an elaborate prank? Maybe. But who would go to such lengths, night after night, without ever being caught on camera? The footprints, the sounds, the precise placement of objects. It all suggests something more intelligent than any known animal, but not quite human either. I've read about other people's experiences with Bigfoot and gift-giving behavior, but I never thought I'd experience anything like this myself. I'm not saying I know what it was, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't bears, wasn't coyotes, wasn't humans, and it definitely wasn't my imagination. Caitlin and I have talked about selling the property, but something keeps us here. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's stubbornness, or maybe it's the hope that someday we'll understand what really happened during those strange few weeks in 2015. We've made some changes, installed better security lights, got more cameras, though they still malfunction occasionally, and we don't go out after dark anymore unless we absolutely have to. The weirdest part? Sometimes, early in the morning, we'll find small objects on our property that weren't there the day before. Nothing as dramatic as before, just little things like unusually shaped rocks or interesting pieces of wood. We never touch them anymore. We just leave them where they are, and they're always gone the next day. I don't expect anyone to believe this story, honestly. If someone had told me this before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But I know what we experienced, and I know it was real. Whatever was out there, whatever was trying to communicate with us in its own strange way, it was real. And sometimes, late at night when I hear those knocks in the distance, I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting to make contact again. Story 5. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I need to get it off my chest. It happened in the summer of 2019, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My husband Jalen and I had just moved to Green Forest, Arkansas, a few months prior. We bought this charming little house on the outskirts of town, backing up to dense woodland with a creek running through the property. It was our dream home, peaceful, secluded, and surrounded by nature. But what we saw that day in July changed everything. It was unusually hot, even for Arkansas standards. The kind of sticky, oppressive heat that makes you want to stay indoors with the AC blasting. Around 2 p.m., I was in our kitchen washing dishes when I heard splashing from the creek. Now, we often had deer come by for a drink, so I didn't think much of it at first. But this was different. The splashing was rhythmic and powerful, unlike anything I'd heard before. I called out to Jalen, who was working from home that day. The splashing got louder as we approached the creek, and that's when my heart nearly stopped. About 30 feet from where we stood, we saw something that I still struggled to explain. There was this massive, pitch-black arm. And when I say massive, I mean it had to be at least 3.5 feet long and as thick as a football, breaking through the water's surface. The way it moved wasn't random. It was deliberate, like something was cooling itself off. The water was spraying everywhere, reaching 3 to 4 feet high. The sunlight caught the wet fur, making it gleam like polished obsidian. I remember being frozen in place, my hand squeezing Jalen's arm so hard I probably left bruises. The sound of the splashing seemed to drown out everything else. The birds, the wind, even my own thundering heartbeat. We must have stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Then, as suddenly as it started, the splashing stopped. The arm disappeared beneath the water without so much as a ripple. The silence that followed was deafening. Jalen wanted to investigate immediately, but I begged him to wait. We stood there for another few minutes, watching, waiting. When nothing else happened, we cautiously approached the spot. The water in that section of the creek was usually about knee-deep, but right where we saw the arm, there was this depression in the creek bed. It wasn't natural, looked almost like something had dug it out to create a deeper pool. As we got closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The normally sandy bank had these indentations, not quite footprints, but disturbed areas that were roughly oval-shaped and massive, easily twice the size of Jalen's size 11 boots. The grass around the bank was matted down in a way that suggested something large had recently passed through. What really got to me was the smell. I've lived around nature my whole life, but this was different. It was this musky, almost sweet odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't place. The smell lingered in that spot for hours afterward. We found what looked like a crude den or burrow about 15 feet from the creek bank, partially hidden by thick undergrowth. It was big enough for something large to shelter in, and the ground around it was cleared in a way that didn't seem natural. There were broken branches around the entrance, snapped in a way that no deer or normal wildlife could manage. The longer we investigated, the more unsettled I became. We found tufts of coarse black hair caught on some low branches near the den. They were thick, almost like horsehair, but different somehow. I wanted to collect some as evidence, but honestly, I was too scared to touch them. What really keeps me up at night is what happened as we were heading back to the house. We heard this deep, rumbling sound coming from the woods behind us. It wasn't quite a growl, more like a heavy breathing, but so deep it seemed to vibrate in my chest. We didn't stick around to investigate that. We practically ran back to the house. For the next few weeks, we heard strange noises at night. Not just the usual forest sounds, but heavy footsteps, breaking branches, and occasionally that same deep breathing. We installed security cameras around the property, but they never caught anything except shadows and unexplained movement in the tree line. The activity seemed to peak around mid-August and then just stopped. No more splashing, no footsteps, no strange sounds. The den we found gradually filled in with leaves and debris, as if nature was reclaiming it. But the depression in the creek is still there. I check every now and then, though I'm not sure why. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in the area. Green Forest and the surrounding Ozarks have a history of strange sightings, but nothing quite like what we saw. Some locals have told us stories about something big living in the forests around here, but most just smile and change the subject when we bring up what happened. Jalen and I have debated whether to sell the house and move, but where would we go? How do you explain to potential buyers that something inexplicable might be living in their backyard? Plus, whatever it was, never showed any aggression toward us. It's almost like we accidentally stumbled upon its private swimming spot. I still get nervous when I hear splashing in the creek, and I don't go near it alone anymore. The rational part of my brain tries to explain it away. Maybe it was some kind of escaped exotic animal, or maybe the heat was playing tricks on our eyes. But then I remember the size of that arm, the deliberate way it moved, the den we found, and that deep, resonant breathing, and I know what we saw was real. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I'll sit on our back porch and stare into the woods, wondering if it's still out there, if it found another creek to cool off in, or if it's watching us just as we watched it that day. The not knowing is perhaps the hardest part. Life has mostly returned to normal, but I'll never look at these woods the same way again. I've never shared this story publicly before. Most people would probably think we're crazy or attention-seeking, but I know what we saw. I don't need anyone to believe me. I'm just hoping that maybe someone else out there has seen something similar and can help me make sense of what happened that summer day in Green Forest. The thing that strikes me most, looking back, is how ordinary everything felt right up until it wasn't. One moment we were just a normal couple living our quiet life in the Arkansas woods, and the next moment, well, everything we thought we knew about what's possible got turned upside down. That's the thing about experiences like this. They don't come with warning signs or dramatic build-ups. They just happen, and afterward, you're left trying to fit them into a world that suddenly seems a whole lot bigger and stranger than you ever imagined. Story 6. It was July 15th, 2023. I remember the date clearly because it was my day off, and I'd planned to do some nature photography in the Ozark National Forest. I'm an amateur photographer, nothing serious, just a hobby to help me decompress from my regular 9-to-5 job at the local hardware store. The weather was perfect that morning, not too hot for Arkansas in July, with a slight breeze that kept the mosquitoes away. I'd parked my old Toyota pickup at one of the lesser-known trailheads about 15 miles outside Marshall. It was around 6:30 a.m., and I wanted to catch the morning light filtering through the trees. I'd been to this spot maybe 3 or 4 times before, so I felt pretty comfortable with the area. The trail wasn't marked on most maps, but locals knew about it. It was one of those places where you might run into the occasional hiker or hunter, but mostly you'd have the whole place to yourself. I'd been walking for about an hour, taking photos of interesting fungi and morning dew on spider webs. Nothing unusual, just a peaceful morning in nature. That's when the first weird thing happened. The birds stopped singing. If you spend any time in the woods, you know how unnatural that sudden silence feels. It's like someone hit a mute button on the forest. I remember checking my phone's time, 7:42 a.m., because I was thinking about heading back soon to grab some breakfast in town. That's when I caught a whiff of something off. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before, kind of like wet dog mixed with something metallic and musty. My first thought was maybe a dead animal nearby, but this was different. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got that feeling you get when you know you're being watched. You know that feeling, right? Like electricity crawling up your spine. I turned around slowly, scanning the trees, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a thick oak tree, was this figure. At first I thought it was someone in a ghillie suit or something, but then it moved. God, the way it moved was just wrong. It was crouched down, maybe about 5 feet tall in that position, but what struck me was its color, this weird light gray that stood out against the green and brown of the forest. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen, and trust me, growing up in Arkansas, I've seen pretty much every kind of local wildlife. The thing was broad, way broader than any person I've ever seen. Even crouching, I could tell its shoulders were probably twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. What really got me, though, what makes me question everything I thought I knew, was what happened next. I had my camera up, thank God for muscle memory, I guess, and I managed to take exactly one photo. It came out blurry because my hands were shaking so bad, but I swear what happened next wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. The creature, it didn't run away or charge at me. It just sank into the ground, like it was standing on some kind of invisible elevator that just dropped straight down. 1 second it was there, the next, gone, just gone. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. After it disappeared, I stood there frozen for what must have been several minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The woods were still dead silent. When I finally got my legs working again, I didn't run, though everything in me was screaming to do just that. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot where I'd seen it. I didn't turn my back until I was back on the main trail, and then I walked as fast as I could back to my truck. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way, feeling like something was following me, but I never saw it again. The photo I took. I've looked at it 100 times since then. It's frustratingly blurry, just a grey blur against the trees. I've thought about sharing it online, but I know what people would say. That it's fake. That it's just a shadow or a bear or someone in a costume. But I know what I saw. The weirdest part. When I got home that evening and checked the local news and social media, there was nothing. No other sightings, no missing hikers, no strange reports. Just a normal summer day in Marshall, Arkansas. I drove past that trailhead every day for the next week on my way to work, but I never got the courage to go back on that trail. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize what I saw. Could it have been a bear with mange? Some kind of military experiment? A practical joke? But none of those explanations fit what I witnessed. The way it moved, that impossible disappearing act, the unnatural silence in the woods, it all adds up to something I can't explain. I've only told a few close friends about this, and I can tell they don't believe me. I get it. I wouldn't believe it either if someone told me this story before it happened to me. But I know what I saw that morning. And I know it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in our world. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I still think about how that creature moved, how it just vanished. Was there some kind of underground structure I didn't know about? Some kind of natural sinkhole? But that doesn't explain its appearance, its impossible proportions, or that weird grey colour. The most frustrating part is not having answers. I've done research since then, looked into other sightings in the Ozarks, but nothing quite matches what I saw. Most Bigfoot sightings describe brown or black creatures, not grey ones, and none of them mention anything about creatures disappearing into the ground like that. I still go hiking and take photos, but never alone anymore, and never on that trail. Sometimes I think about going back, setting up some trail cameras, trying to document whatever it was I saw. But then I remember that feeling of absolute wrongness that came over me when I saw it, and I know I'm better off staying away. I don't expect anyone to believe this story, and honestly, I'm not sure I would believe it if I hadn't experienced it myself. All I know is that something impossible happened to me that morning in the Arkansas woods, and I'll never look at the forest the same way again. Whatever I saw that day wasn't supposed to exist, and maybe that's why it tried so hard to stay hidden. Story 7. I remember it clearly because we'd just finished preparing for the harvest. My golden delicious and Honeycrisp trees were loaded with fruit, probably the best crop I'd seen in years. The apples were just days away from being perfect for picking. I'd spent that whole day doing maintenance on my tractor, getting ready for harvest season. My dog Buck, a German Shepherd mix I've had for 8 years, was doing his usual patrol of the property. He's always been a fantastic guard dog, fearless really. He once chased off a mountain lion that was stalking our chickens. That night was unusually quiet. Usually you hear all sorts of nature sounds, crickets, owls, the wind in the trees. But there was this weird stillness in the air. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I should have known something was off. Buck was acting strange too. He kept whining at the back door instead of wanting to do his usual evening patrol. I figured he was just tired from running around all day. I went to bed around 10 p.m. like usual. Around 2:30 a.m. I woke up to this weird thumping sound. At first I thought it was just the wind picking up, maybe a storm rolling in. But then I heard it again, this rhythmic, heavy sound, like someone walking but with much more weight behind it. Buck, who usually sleeps at the foot of my bed, was completely alert, hackles raised, but he wasn't barking. He was just trembling. I'd never seen him like that before. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, standard procedure out here when investigating strange noises, and headed to the window. The moon was pretty bright that night, and I could see movement in my orchard. At first, I thought maybe some teens had snuck in to steal apples. It wouldn't be the first time. But what I saw when I shined my light toward the trees made my blood run cold. There was this figure. I say figure because my brain couldn't really process what I was seeing. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, with incredibly broad shoulders. It was reaching up into one of my apple trees, and I could hear the branches cracking under its grip. The way it moved wasn't like anything I'd ever seen, fluid but powerful, like it had incredible strength but knew exactly how to use it. I stood there frozen, watching this thing methodically move from tree to tree. It wasn't just eating the apples. It was breaking whole branches off like they were twigs, examining the fruit before taking these enormous bites. The sound of its chewing was unlike anything I'd ever heard, this deep, wet crunching that seemed to reverberate through my chest. The rational part of my brain kept trying to say it was a bear, but I've seen plenty of bears in my life. This thing was standing perfectly upright. Its movements were too deliberate, too human-like. But what really got me was when it turned slightly, and my flashlight caught its hand. The fingers were massive, easily twice the length of human fingers, and the way it was delicately picking through the apples showed an intelligence that made my skin crawl. I thought about firing a warning shot, but something deep in my gut told me that would be a terrible idea. Buck, who's usually first in line to defend the property, was pressed against my legs, shaking so hard I could feel it through my boots. When an animal that's been bred for generations to protect and fight is that terrified, you listen to it. The creature spent what felt like hours in my orchard. I watched it systematically destroy tree after tree, not just eating but almost examining everything it touched. The worst part was the breathing, this deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to fill the entire valley. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost like a human breath, but amplified 10 times over. Around 4 a.m., it finally seemed to have had its fill. What it did next still haunts me. It turned, and I swear it looked right at my window. I don't know if it could see me in the darkness, but I felt seen. The intelligence in that moment was undeniable. It then walked, not lumbered, not crawled, but walked toward the tree line at the edge of my property. The ground literally shook with each step. I could see the impressions it was leaving in the soil, even from my window. When the sun came up, I finally worked up the courage to go outside. Buck refused to leave the barn, literally planted himself in the corner and wouldn't budge. He stayed there for 3 straight days, only coming out when I physically carried him. The damage to my orchard was catastrophic. 12 of my best trees were practically destroyed. The branches weren't just broken, they were twisted and mangled in a way that showed incredible strength. But it was the physical evidence that really shook me. The footprints were massive, 16 inches if they were a centimeter, and deep, so deep that whatever made them had to weigh an enormous amount. I found half-eaten apples scattered everywhere, and each one had these distinct finger impressions in them, like someone had carefully positioned them before taking a bite. These weren't claw marks or teeth marks like you'd see from a bear. These were clearly fingers. I called the local sheriff, but I could tell by his face he didn't believe me. He took some photos, wrote a report, and suggested it might have been vandals or maybe a bear, even though there hadn't been a bear sighting in this area for decades. I knew what I saw wasn't either of those things. That night, I set up every trail camera I owned around my property. For the next week I caught nothing on video, but the audio. God, the audio. Every night between 2 and 4 a.m., the cameras would pick up this deep rhythmic breathing and these strange thumping sounds against the barn walls. It was like whatever it was knew where the cameras were and was staying just out of sight, but wanted me to know it was still there. The last bit of activity I recorded was exactly 1 week after the initial incident. The breathing sounds were closer than ever that night, and there was this moment on the audio where it sounds like something enormous is right next to the camera. Then there's this sound, not quite a growl, not quite speech, that I still can't explain. After that night, everything just stopped. The breathing, the footprints, all of it. It's been over 6 years now, and I still haven't fully recovered from what happened. I've planted new trees, but I've noticed nothing grows quite right in the spots where the original trees were destroyed. Buck never really went back to his old self. He refuses to patrol the orchard at night now, and he gets extremely agitated around the full moon. I've tried to convince myself it was just a bizarre series of events, maybe some kind of mass hysteria or stress-induced hallucination. But then I look at those trees, remember the intelligence in those movements, and hear that breathing in my dreams, and I know what I saw was real. I still work my orchard, but I never go out at night anymore. Some things you just can't unsee, and some questions are better left unanswered. The sheriff's report probably still lists it as vandalism or animal damage, but I know what I saw. I've lived in Montana my whole life, worked this land for decades, and seen every kind of wildlife there is to see out here. What visited my orchard that night wasn't any known animal, and sometimes, late at night when the moon is full and the wind dies down, I can still hear that deep, rhythmic breathing, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in these mountains, watching and waiting. Story 8. What happened that night in Pine Grove changed my life forever, and even now, almost 5 years later, I still get chills thinking about it. I guess I'm finally ready to write this down, even though I know some people won't believe me. I don't really care anymore. I just need to get this off my chest. I'm a nurse at Providence Portland Medical Center, and I was working the night shift back in 2019. Nothing unusual about that night, just a typical 12-hour shift in the ER. I remember it was early March, still pretty cold, and we'd had some weird weather that week. The drive home was always peaceful at 3 a.m., barely any cars on the road. I lived alone in Pine Grove then, in this little house backed up against the forest. It was perfect for me. Quiet, private, and I could afford it on my salary. That night, I pulled into my driveway around 3:20 a.m. like usual. I remember checking the time because I was thinking about getting a few hours of sleep before running some errands later. The motion lights on my garage came on as I approached, and I used the remote to open the garage door. Nothing seemed off at first. I was honestly half asleep and just on autopilot like any other night. I pulled in and was about to get out of my car when I heard this sound. It's hard to describe, but it was like a deep, rumbling breath. You know that feeling when you're alone and suddenly realize you're not. That primal instinct that makes the hair on your neck stand up. That hit me like a truck. I froze with my hand on the door handle, heart suddenly pounding. The garage was dim. I only had one flickering light bulb in there that I'd been meaning to replace. But in that moment, I swear, I could feel something massive shifting in the shadows behind my car. The air felt thick, heavy with this overwhelming musky smell that made my eyes water. It was like wet dog mixed with something rotting, but 100 times stronger. I wanted to turn around so badly, to look in my rearview mirror, but I was terrified of what I might see. Then I heard it move. The concrete floor creaked. And let me tell you, concrete doesn't creak unless something really heavy is moving on it. Whatever it was big enough to make the floor strain under its weight. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grab my phone. I tried to call 911, but there was no signal, which was weird because I always had service in my garage. The fluorescent light started flickering more intensely and then just died completely. I was sitting there in total darkness, except for my dashboard lights. That's when I heard the breathing get closer. It was right beside my car now, and I could feel the vehicle actually shift slightly, like something was leaning against it. The smell was overwhelming. I'm not ashamed to admit I started crying silently. I've dealt with aggressive patients, seen some horrible things in the ER, but nothing had ever terrified me like this. Then my car's motion sensor started going off. You know, the one that tells you if something's too close when you're parking. It was detecting something massive moving around the vehicle. The dashboard display showed objects all around the car, like I was surrounded, but I still couldn't see anything in the darkness. I heard this horrible scraping sound, like giant claws dragging across the concrete. It circled my car once, twice, 3 times. Each circuit it made, the breathing got more agitated, more aggressive. I could hear what sounded like teeth clicking together, like when a dog chatters its teeth, but much louder. The temperature in the garage dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in the dashboard lights. The windows started fogging up, and I was terrified because I knew that meant whatever was out there wouldn't be able to see me anymore. But I also wouldn't be able to see it. I kept wiping a small circle clean on my driver's window, desperate to maintain some view of my surroundings. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, in the reflection of my side mirror, something massive moved past the car. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. All I could make out was dark, matted fur and this huge, hulking shoulder. I caught a glimpse of what looked like a massive hand, but not quite a hand, more like a massive paw with longer fingers, as it moved past my mirror. The next part still haunts my nightmares. It pressed its face against my driver's side window. I couldn't see it clearly through the fog, but I could make out the outline of something that looked vaguely like a face, but wrong somehow, too big, too wide, with a sloped forehead. The fog on the window suddenly cleared in two spots where it was breathing, and I could see these eyes, dark, intelligent eyes that were definitely not animal eyes, but weren't human either. They were studying me. I've never felt smaller or more vulnerable than in that moment. Whatever this thing was, it was thinking, analyzing, deciding what to do with me. I could hear it sniffing the air, and its breath fogged up the window even more. The smell was so strong I started gagging. Then my phone suddenly lit up with notifications, all at once, like it had suddenly got signal again. The creature jerked back from the window, startled by the light or the sound or both. I heard it slam into something, probably my shelving units, because there was a huge crash and the sound of all my stored items hitting the floor. That's when it really started to panic. It started making these awful sounds, not quite roars, not quite screams, but something in between. My whole car was shaking as it thrashed around the garage. I could hear it throwing things, breaking things, and then, this is the part that still makes me question everything I thought I knew. It started pounding on the garage door. The banging was desperate, frantic. Through my rearview mirror, I could see the garage door starting to bend outward, like something massive was trying to force its way out. The metal was screeching as it warped, and I was certain the whole thing was about to come crashing down. With one final tremendous bang, the creature burst through the garage door. The metal twisted and tore like it was paper. As it escaped, I caught one final glimpse of it in my mirror, just a massive dark shape disappearing into the forest behind my house. The motion lights outside were going crazy, turning on and off repeatedly. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, shaking and crying. When I finally got the courage to look at my phone, it was 4:15 a.m. Somehow, almost an hour had passed. I checked my security camera app, but there was nothing, just a gap in the footage from 3:27 a.m. to 4:15 a.m. When I finally got out of my car, my garage looked like a war zone. Everything was knocked over, broken, or thrown around. But the worst part was the garage door, bent outward like a giant fist had punched it, with these long dark hairs caught in the twisted metal. I collected some of them in a plastic bag, thinking I'd need proof of what happened. The smell lingered for weeks. No amount of cleaning or air freshener could get rid of it. I tried showing the hairs to a friend who works in wildlife biology, but she couldn't identify them. Said they weren't from any animal native to Oregon or anywhere else she knew of. I ended up moving away from Pine Grove a month later. Couldn't handle being there anymore, especially at night. I kept the hairs, though, sealed in a box in my closet. Sometimes I take them out and look at them, just to remind myself that I didn't imagine it all. The thing that really gets to me, even now, is those eyes. They weren't just animal eyes. There was something else there, something that understood what it was looking at. Sometimes I wonder if it was just as scared as I was, trapped in that garage. But mostly, I wonder if it's still out there in the forests of Oregon, and if anyone else has seen it too scared to speak up. I still work night shifts at the hospital, had to keep paying the bills, but I moved to an apartment in the city. No more houses backed up to forests, no more garages. And every time I smell that musky, wild smell in the air, even just a hint of it, I get right back in my car and drive the other way. That's my story. I know how it sounds, trust me. If someone had told me this before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw, what I smelled, what I experienced. Whatever was in my garage that night wasn't supposed to exist, but it does, and I haven't had a good night's sleep since. Story 9. It was a scorching hot Tuesday in Yellville, Arkansas, the kind of summer day where the humidity makes it feel like you're breathing through a wet blanket. I just finished working from home around 2 p.m. and decided to cool off in my backyard pool. I live in a pretty secluded area with about 3 acres of land backing up to dense woodland. It's usually so peaceful here. That's why I bought the place 2 years ago. I was floating on my back, enjoying the quiet and watching clouds drift by. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the pool's edge and distant bird calls. I remember feeling so relaxed, thinking how lucky I was to have this little slice of paradise to myself. That's when I first noticed something was off. The birds suddenly went silent. You know that eerie quiet that falls right before a storm? It was like that, but worse. The air felt heavy, charged somehow. The hairs on my arms stood up despite the heat. I turned my head toward the tree line, about 40 yards from my pool. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just shadows between the trees. But then it moved. Oh God, it moved. What I saw, I'm still struggling to describe it accurately. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. The shoulders alone must have been 4 feet wide, but it wasn't just the size that terrified me. It was how human-like it was, while being completely inhuman at the same time. Its body was covered in this thick, reddish-brown fur, like rust-colored coffee grounds. But underneath that fur, I could see muscle definition that reminded me of a bodybuilder, especially across its chest. The pectoral muscles were clearly visible even through the fur. This wasn't some guy in a costume. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. I remember thinking, this can't be real, over and over, but I couldn't look away. The creature was partially obscured by the trees, but I could tell it was watching me. Its face was mostly hidden by fur, but I felt its gaze locked onto me. That's when the strangest part happened. I heard, no, more like felt, a voice in my head. It wasn't exactly words, more like an urgent feeling, a warning. Don't look directly at it. I know how crazy this sounds, but it felt like some kind of protective force or guardian angel was trying to help me. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place, half floating in the water. I managed to slowly lower my gaze, staring at the water instead of the creature. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. The water around me felt ice cold suddenly, despite the summer heat. This is where things get fuzzy. I know it sounds convenient, like every other weird story where people conveniently can't remember parts. But I swear on everything I hold dear that this is true. The next clear memory I have is sitting on the edge of my pool, soaking wet and shivering, even though it was still blazing hot outside. When I checked my phone, it was 3:17 p.m. Somehow, 45 minutes had just vanished. Gone. I have no memory of getting out of the pool, no memory of what happened after I looked away from the creature. Just nothing. A complete blank spot in my memory. The creature was gone, but the woods still felt wrong somehow. The birds hadn't come back yet. I grabbed my towel and ran inside, locked every door and window and closed all the blinds. I spent the rest of the day huddled on my couch, jumping at every little sound. I know what people will think reading this. Trust me, I've gone over every possible explanation in my head. Maybe it was heat exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw. The creature was as real as the pool I was swimming in. The weirdest part is what I found the next morning. When I finally worked up the courage to go outside, I noticed something that still makes my skin crawl. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the woods, huge footprints at least 16 inches long. They were partially obscured, like something had tried to cover them up, but they were definitely there. I took photos, but when I looked at them later, they just looked like random depressions in the dirt. Nothing like the clear prints I saw with my own eyes. I've never shared this story publicly before. For months, I couldn't even talk about it. How do you tell people you saw what was clearly a Sasquatch in your backyard in Arkansas? That you lost 45 minutes of time after some kind of warning voice told you not to look at it? It sounds insane. I know it does. But here's the thing. I know what I experienced. I still live in the same house, but I never use the pool alone anymore. I installed security cameras all around the property, motion sensor lights too. Nothing like this has happened again, but sometimes, especially on quiet summer afternoons, I'll get this feeling, like I'm being watched. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Honestly, if someone had told me this story 2 years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw that day. Something was there, something that shouldn't exist according to everything we know about the natural world, and somehow, something or someone knew I needed to look away. The hardest part isn't the disbelief from others, it's the not knowing. What happened during those missing minutes? Why did it appear to me? Was the warning voice real? And if so, what was it? I have no answers, just this story and the lingering fear that someday, whatever it was, might come back. I still get nervous every time I look toward those woods, especially in the late afternoon when the shadows start to lengthen. Sometimes I think I see movement between the trees, but I never look directly at it anymore. Maybe that voice knew something I didn't. Maybe not looking is what saved me that day. If you're ever in a similar situation, if you ever encounter something that your mind tells you can't possibly exist, and you hear that warning voice, listen to it. Don't look directly at it. I don't know why, but I feel like that's important. It might just save your life, like I think it saved mine that day in June. Story 10. It was supposed to be a routine research trip in October 2022. The local wildlife service had reported unusual animal behavior patterns. I don't know why, but I feel like that's important. It might just save your life, like I think it saved mine that day in June. Story 10. It was supposed to be a routine research trip in October 2022. The local wildlife service had reported unusual animal behavior patterns in the area, and I was called in to document and analyze the situation. I'd done this kind of work hundreds of times before. Set up some cameras, collect data, write a report. Simple stuff. But from the moment I arrived at Lead Hill, something felt off. I remember checking into the small motel on the outskirts of town around 9 a.m. The morning was unusually cold for Arkansas, with this thick fog that seemed to cling to everything. The elderly woman at the front desk kept warning me about going into those woods alone. At the time, I brushed it off as small-town superstition. God, I wish I'd listened. I spent the morning setting up my equipment, motion sensor cameras, audio recorders, the usual gear. The forest was dead quiet, which should have been my first red flag. Usually you'd hear birds, squirrels, something. But there was just this heavy silence that seemed to press down on you. The only sound was the occasional creak of the power lines running through a clearing about half a mile from my base camp. Around 2 p.m., I started noticing something weird with my equipment. The batteries in my cameras were draining unusually fast. I'm talking about brand new batteries dying within hours. I've worked with this equipment for years, and I've never seen anything like it. I kept having to replace them, which meant I've studied wolf and coyote vocalizations extensively, but this was different. It had this almost human quality to it that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my handheld camera and started recording. That's when the lights started. At first, I thought it was just the sun reflecting off the power lines, but these were different. They moved like they were alive, dancing along the cables, blue-white orbs that would appear, zip along the line for a few hundred feet, then vanish. I caught it all on video, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the camera steady. As the sun started to set, things escalated quickly. The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. The whooping sounds got closer, and now they seemed to be coming from multiple directions. I'm not easily scared. I've faced down angry bears and territorial moose, but something about those sounds triggered a primal fear in me I'd never felt before. Then the trees started falling. Not small ones. We're talking massive, healthy oaks just suddenly crashing down. The first one fell about 200 yards from me, and I convinced myself it was just coincidence. But then another fell, closer this time, and another. There was no wind, no logical explanation, just the sound of wood splintering and that horrible whooping getting closer. I started packing up my gear as fast as I could, but my hands were trembling so badly I kept dropping things. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Something massive moved between the trees. When I turned to look directly at it, it was gone, but I could feel it watching me. The air felt heavy, like right before a massive storm, and there was this smell, kind of like wet dog mixed with something metallic. I abandoned most of my equipment and just grabbed my cameras and notebook. As I was running back to my truck, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy footsteps that seemed to shake the ground. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whooping sound was so close now, it felt like it was right in my ear. I made it to my truck somehow, fumbling with the keys so badly I dropped them twice before getting the door open. As I started the engine, I caught something in my headlights, just for a split second. A huge, dark figure, easily 8 feet tall, moving with an eerily fluid grace that something that size shouldn't have been capable of. Then it was gone, melting into the darkness like it was never there. I drove straight back to the motel, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I tried to review the footage from my cameras, every single one had malfunctioned. Hours of video, all corrupted. The only things that survived were a few blurry photos on my phone showing the strange lights on the power lines. The next morning, I went back with local authorities to retrieve my abandoned equipment. Everything was gone, not just my gear, but any sign that anything had happened. No fallen trees, no footprints, nothing. The forest was alive with normal sounds again, birds singing like nothing had ever happened. I filed my report, trying to stick to the objective facts, but I knew nobody would believe the full story. I quit my research position a month later. I couldn't face going back into the field. Some nights, I still wake up hearing that whooping sound, and I swear I can feel something watching me through my bedroom window. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened that day in Lead Hill. I've read every scientific paper I could find about animal behavior, atmospheric phenomena, everything that could explain what I experienced. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't something science can explain. Whatever was in those woods that day wasn't something that should exist in our world. I still have nightmares about those few hours in the forest. The way the lights moved along those power lines, the impossible grace of that massive figure, the sound of those trees falling, it all haunts me. Sometimes I wish I could convince myself it was all just a stress-induced hallucination, but I know what I experienced was real. I just can't explain it, and maybe that's the scariest part of all. I've never gone back to Lead Hill, and I never will. Whatever's in those woods, it's better left alone. Sometimes I think about the stories we tell ourselves about what's really out there in the wilderness, and I realize now that maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. All I know is that my experience in those Arkansas woods changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and some nights, when I hear that wind howling outside my window, I can't help but wonder if it's trying to tell me something. Story 11. I've been a professional hunter for over 20 years, working primarily in the Hudson Valley region of New York. What I encountered on October 15th, 2021, in the woods outside Millbrook has fundamentally changed my understanding of what exists in our forests. I've spent countless hours in these woods, but nothing in my experience prepared me for what I found that day. The morning started like any other fall hunting day. I left my truck parked at the end of Bennett Road around 5:30 a.m., planning to scout some new territory for the upcoming deer season. The weather was unusually cold for mid-October, hovering around 35 degrees Fahrenheit with a light fog clinging to the ground. I was about 3 miles into state forest land, well away from any hiking trails or camps. The first sign that something was off came around 7:45 a.m. I'm extremely familiar with forest sounds. It's crucial for tracking. But I started noticing an unusual pattern of silence. You know how the woods normally have this constant background noise of birds, squirrels, and wind in the trees? All that just stopped. At first, I thought maybe there was a coyote or bear nearby, but this felt different. The silence had weight to it, if that makes any sense. Then I noticed the smell. Anyone who hunts knows there are all sorts of natural forest odors, including decay. But this was different. It was this overwhelming, putrid stench that seemed to come and go with the wind. The closest I can compare it to is a mix between rotting meat and wet, moldy clothes, but even that doesn't quite capture it. It was strong enough to make my eyes water. As I moved further into the woods, following game trails I'd marked on my GPS, I started hearing these weird rhythmic sounds. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just woodpeckers, but the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. It sounded like someone taking a heavy branch and striking trees in a specific rhythm. 3 quick hits, pause, 2 slow hits, pause, repeat. The sound seemed to move around the forest, never coming from quite the same place twice. Around 9:30 a.m., I came into a clearing I hadn't seen before, and that's when I saw it. I've built plenty of hunting blinds in my time, but this was something else entirely. Standing in the center of the clearing was this massive structure made of interwoven branches and small trees. It had to be at least 12 feet tall, maybe more. The construction was what really got to me. These weren't just branches thrown together. They were meticulously woven, creating this complex lattice pattern that looked almost engineered. Some of the branches used were thick enough that it would take significant strength to bend them the way they were bent. The temperature around the structure was noticeably colder than the surrounding area. I'm talking a good 10-15 degrees difference that you could feel the moment you stepped within about 30 feet of it. My rangefinder confirmed the affected area was almost exactly a 30-foot radius around the structure. The ground within this circle was completely bare. No leaves, no undergrowth, just packed dirt. What really made my skin crawl were the trees around the clearing. Every single tree within that 30-foot radius had these deep, parallel scratch marks running up their trunks. These weren't bear marks. I've seen plenty of those. These were different. 4 parallel lines, deeply gouged into the bark, consistently starting at about 8 feet up the trunk. Some looked fresh, others older, suggesting whatever made them had been returning to this spot over time. But the worst part was what I found inside the structure. Right in the center was this perfectly arranged pile of deer bones. When I say perfectly arranged, I mean these bones were methodically stacked and sorted by size. All of them were completely clean. No tissue, no sinew, just white bone. I've been hunting deer for decades, and I've never seen bones cleaned that thoroughly by natural decomposition or scavengers. The pile contained what I'd estimate to be the remains of at least 6 or 7 deer. The rhythmic banging was getting louder now, and seemed to be coming from multiple directions. I'm not easily spooked. You can't be in this line of work. But something about this whole situation set off every alarm bell in my body. That's when I noticed my phone had no signal, despite usually having at least 2 bars in these woods. My GPS was still working, but the temperature reading was going haywire, jumping between numbers that made no sense. I started taking photos and video with my phone, trying to document everything I was seeing. The images came out strangely dark, like they were taken at dusk rather than mid-morning. In the videos, there's this weird distortion whenever I pan across the structure, almost like digital static. That's when I heard it. This deep, guttural sound that I can only describe as a cross between a whale song and an elk bugle, but much deeper and louder than either. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound physically resonated in my chest, like standing next to a massive speaker. I've heard every animal native to these woods, and this wasn't anything I'd ever encountered before. The knocking sounds suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to die. Then I heard heavy footsteps in the leaf litter behind me, slow and deliberate. Whatever it was big. Each step made the ground vibrate slightly. The putrid smell became overwhelming. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran. 20 years of hunting experience went right out the window, and I ran as fast as I could in the direction I thought would take me back to my truck. I could hear movement in the woods parallel to my path, keeping pace with me, but always just out of sight. The knocking sounds started again, this time from multiple directions, almost like they were coordinating something. I ran until my lungs were burning. When I finally stopped, I was completely disoriented. It took me almost 2 hours to find my way back to my truck, even with my GPS. The whole time, I could hear those knocking sounds in the distance, always seeming to come from the direction I was trying to go. When I finally made it back to my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys in the ignition. The drive home is mostly a blur. I spent the rest of that day trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I looked at the photos and videos I'd taken, but they were all corrupted somehow, just black frames with weird digital artifacts. I reported what I found to the local forest service, but when I went back with 2 rangers the next day, we couldn't find the clearing or the structure. We searched for hours, but it was like it had never existed. The GPS coordinates I'd marked showed us standing in thick brush, with no sign of any clearing or strange structure. I've been back to those woods many times since then, trying to find that clearing again. I never have. But sometimes, when I'm out there alone, I'll catch that same putrid smell on the wind, or hear those rhythmic knocks in the distance. Whatever I encountered that day, it's still out there. I'm sure of it. I've struggled with whether to share this experience. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what I saw, to find some logical explanation. But I know what I encountered wasn't natural, wasn't normal. I'm sharing this now because I think people need to know what's out there in our woods. I'm not asking anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw, and I know I'm not the only one who's seen it. Story 12. It was early February 2020, and I was conducting a geological survey for a mining company near the Clearwater National Forest. The area was remote, about 30 miles from the nearest town, and the winter had been particularly harsh that year. I'd set up my base camp near a small frozen creek, planning to spend a week collecting magnetic field data and rock samples. The first 2 days were completely normal, just me, my equipment, and the endless white landscape. The temperature stayed around 15 degrees during the day, dropping below 0 at night. I had my trusty magnetic survey equipment, sample collection tools, and enough supplies to last 10 days if needed. The solitude never bothered me before. It was actually one of the reasons I loved my job. Everything changed on the 3rd morning. I was taking readings near the creek when I noticed something odd about the ice. There was a line of perfect impressions crossing the frozen stream, each about 15 inches long. At first, I thought maybe it was just natural ice formation, but as I got closer, I realized they were footprints. Massive footprints. But what really caught my attention wasn't their size. It was how they were formed. Each print had somehow melted through about an inch of solid ice, then refrozen. The edges were perfectly defined, like someone had pressed a hot iron into the ice. I've tracked plenty of wildlife in my work, bears, moose, elk, but I'd never seen anything like this. The stride length between prints was enormous, easily 6 feet. Whatever made these tracks was bipedal and huge. I took out my infrared thermometer to check the prints, even though they were obviously old. The surrounding ice measured 12 degrees, but inside the prints it was several degrees warmer, even after what must have been hours or days. My scientific mind kicked in, and I started documenting everything. I took photos with my scale marker, made measurements, and collected ice samples from inside the prints. But when I pulled out my magnetometer to continue my survey work, things got even stranger. The readings were all over the place. Usually this equipment is incredibly reliable. I can detect minor variations in the Earth's magnetic field that help identify mineral deposits. But around these tracks, the readings were jumping wildly, showing fluctuations that made no sense. As the day went on, I followed the tracks as far as I could while continuing my survey. They led into a dense stand of old-growth forest before disappearing where the ground was frozen solid. I noticed broken branches high up in the trees, we're talking 8 to 10 feet off the ground, snapped in a way that couldn't have been done by wind or snow load. That's when I found the first clump of hair. It was caught on a piece of bark about 7 feet up a pine tree. Dark, coarse, about 6 inches long. I've seen bear fur, moose fur, every kind of local wildlife fur, and this wasn't anything I recognized. It was thicker than human hair, but not quite like animal fur either. I carefully collected it in a sample bag, thinking I'd get it analyzed later. The sun was setting earlier than I'd liked, one of the joys of winter fieldwork, so I headed back to camp. That's when I started feeling watched. Any field geologist develops a kind of sixth sense about their surroundings. You have to when you're working alone in remote areas. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no small animals, nothing. Just this oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then I heard it, this deep, rhythmic breathing. Not like an animal panting or sniffing, but slow, deliberate breaths that sounded almost human, but far too deep and resonant. It seemed to come from the tree line about 50 yards from my camp. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to move, always staying just out of sight in the growing darkness. I rushed to my tent and grabbed my satellite phone, but of course there was no signal. The thick cloud cover that had been threatening snow all day was probably blocking it. The breathing continued, now accompanied by something else. Deliberate knocking sounds, like someone taking a baseball bat to tree trunks. It wasn't random. It had a pattern. 3 quick hits, pause, 2 hits, pause, repeat. The sounds seemed to be coming from different directions, as if whatever was making them was circling my camp. The temperature dropped rapidly as night fell, but I noticed something odd on my weather station's digital thermometer. While the ambient temperature was around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, there were sudden, localized temperature spikes. The sensor would jump up 30-40 degrees for a few seconds, then drop back down. This happened several times over the next few hours. I stayed in my tent, recording everything on my phone and trying to keep my hands from shaking too much to write in my field notebook. The knocking continued sporadically through the night, sometimes close, sometimes far away. Around 3 a.m., I heard heavy footsteps in the snow, slow, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly. Whatever it was huge and heavy enough to compress the frozen ground. I had my headlamp off, not wanting to draw attention, but I could see a massive silhouette pass between my tent and the moon. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a bulky frame. The breathing was louder now, accompanied by what sounded like low growls or rumbles, so deep they were almost subsonic. I could feel them more than hear them. The thing circled my tent 3 times. I know because I could feel its footsteps through the ground and hear that deep breathing completing the circuit. Each time it passed between me and the moonlight, the temperature in my tent would spike noticeably. My instruments, which I always kept carefully organized, were going haywire. The magnetometer was beeping erratically, showing readings that were off the charts. Then it stopped, directly in front of my tent. The breathing was so close I could smell it, a strange, musky odor mixed with something metallic, like hot metal or ozone. My tent wall bulged slightly, as if something was leaning close to investigate. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. The temperature inside the tent rose dramatically, and sweat started running down my face despite the sub-zero temperatures outside. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard it move away, its footsteps growing fainter. The temperature gradually returned to normal. I didn't sleep at all that night, listening to those knockings and occasional deep breaths until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I practically jumped out of my tent, determined to document everything before the evidence disappeared. The snow around my camp was covered in those massive footprints, each one partially melted into the frozen ground. The tracks formed a clear circle around my tent, exactly as I'd sensed during the night. What really shook me was finding more hair samples, not just 1 or 2 strands, but whole clumps of it, caught on my equipment cases and tent lines. But the most unsettling discovery was the trees. Several of the larger pines around my camp had fresh damage about 8 to 10 feet up their trunks. The bark was stripped away in patches, and there were clear impact marks that matched the knocking I'd heard. The weird part was that the damaged areas were warm to the touch, even hours later, and my infrared thermometer showed they were about 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding bark. I packed up my camp in record time, collected as many samples as I could, and got out of there. The whole way back to my truck, I could hear those knocking sounds following me, always staying just far enough away that I couldn't see what was making them. I've spent months trying to rationalize what happened. I sent the hair samples to 2 different labs. One said they were contaminated and unusable. The other said they couldn't match them to any known species, but suggested they might be from an unknown primate. The photos of the footprints came out strangely blurred, though I know my camera was working perfectly. The magnetic readings from that day show impossible anomalies that my colleagues can't explain. What keeps nagging at me isn't just what I saw or heard, but the heat. Whatever this thing was, it was generating enough body heat to melt ice and warm trees in sub-zero temperatures. The magnetic disturbances suggest something beyond normal biological processes. I've gone over every possible natural explanation, but nothing fits all the evidence. I haven't gone back to that area, and I've turned down several lucrative survey contracts in the region. Call it cowardice or common sense, but something tells me that whatever I encountered out there was studying me as much as I was trying to study it. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear those methodical knocks and feel that oppressive, watchful presence. The rational part of my mind tries to dismiss it, but I know what I experienced. Whatever it was intelligent, it was powerful, and it was definitely not something science can easily explain. I still have the samples locked away in my home office, along with my field notes and instrument readings. Sometimes I think about sending them to a major research institution, but I know how that would go over in the scientific community. For now, I'm just documenting everything and trying to make sense of an encounter that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Story 13. Our farm has been in the family since my grandfather's time. We mainly grow corn, about 80 acres of it, with some cattle grazing on the north side of the property. It's good land, right up against the Jefferson National Forest. September 2017 started like any other harvest season. The corn was nearly ready, standing tall at about 8 feet, golden and proud under the Virginia sun. The first sign something was wrong came on September 12th. I was doing my morning check of the fields when I spotted something odd about a quarter-mile from the house. From ground level, it just looked like some damaged corn, but when I climbed up on the grain silo for a better view, my blood ran cold. There was a perfect circle, about 30 feet in diameter, where the corn stalks had been systematically laid down. Not torn up or destroyed like you'd expect from deer or bears. These stalks were carefully broken at the base and arranged in a spiral pattern, with all the corn ears neatly stacked in the center. I've dealt with crop circles before, usually punk kids or pranksters. But this was different. The precision was unsettling. Each stalk was broken at exactly the same height, about 18 inches from the ground. There were no footprints leading in or out, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest how someone could have done this without leaving a trace. What really got to me were the tracks I found 3 days later. I was checking another section of the field when I discovered a second circle, identical to the first, about 200 yards away. But this time, there was a clear trail connecting the two circles. The footprints were unlike anything I'd ever seen, 18 inches long, deeply pressed into the hard soil. We're talking about impressions that would require something weighing at least 800 pounds to make. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet. Our cattle started acting strange around the same time. They'd always grazed freely across the north pasture, but now they wouldn't go within 100 yards of where the circles were. They'd bunch up together, acting nervous, eyes fixed on the tree line. Even our most docile cow, old Bessie, who'd never spooked at anything in her life, would get agitated and refuse to move closer. Then there were the dogs. We have 3 German shepherds, Duke, Max and Lady, working dogs who've been with us for years. They're usually calm at night, only barking if they spot coyotes or the occasional deer. But starting mid-September, they developed this bizarre routine. Every single night at exactly 2 a.m., they'd all start barking frantically at the forest edge. Not their normal alert barks. This was different, almost panicked. They'd stand rigid, hackles raised, focused on the same spot in the tree line, and nothing could distract them. On September 23rd, everything escalated. I'd been staying up late watching the dogs from my back porch, trying to figure out what was setting them off. The moon was nearly full that night, casting long shadows across the cornfield. At exactly 2 a.m., like clockwork, the dogs started their barking. But this time, something answered. The sound that came from the forest, I still struggle to describe it. It started as a low rumble, almost below hearing range, but you could feel it in your chest. Then it rose into this horrifying howl that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't a coyote, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I'd heard in 45 years of farming. The dogs immediately went silent and ran to cower under the porch. That's when I saw it. The corn at the forest edge began to move, not like when wind blows through it, but deliberately. Something massive was moving through the field. In the moonlight, I could make out a dark shape, at least 8 feet tall, pushing through the corn with slow, purposeful movements. The corn stalks only came up to its chest. I stood there, paralyzed, as this thing methodically made its way through my field. The smell hit me next, this overwhelming putrid, musky odor that made my eyes water. Through the gaps in the corn, I caught glimpses of dark, matted fur, massive shoulders, and long arms that seemed to hang down past its knees. What happened next will haunt me forever. This creature reached a spot about 150 yards from the porch and stopped. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned its head and looked directly at me. Even at that distance in the moonlight, I could see its eyes reflecting like amber coins. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. Then it made another sound, not the howl from before, but a series of low, rhythmic grunts that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The dogs, still under the porch, started whimpering. The thing turned away and continued through the field, moving with shocking grace for its size, and disappeared into the forest on the other side. The next morning, I found another circle. This one was different, larger, about 50 feet across, with the corn stalks woven together in an intricate pattern I still can't figure out. The ears of corn in the center were stacked in a perfect pyramid, each one carefully stripped of its kernels. The ground around the circle was covered in those massive footprints, and there was a strange, oily residue on some of the broken stalks that made my skin crawl when I touched it. This pattern continued for 2 more weeks. Every few days, a new circle would appear, always with the same precise arrangement, always connected by those huge footprints. We lost about 2 acres of corn in total, but honestly, I was too terrified to care about the crop damage. The dogs kept up their 2 a.m. routine, though they never barked as frantically as that first night. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The last circle appeared on October 8th. After that, nothing. No more circles, no more footprints, no more nighttime howls. The dogs gradually returned to normal, and the cattle eventually went back to grazing across the whole pasture. But the fear didn't leave with it. I've never reported this officially. Who would believe me? I've got pictures of the circles and the footprints, but they don't capture the scale of what happened, the precision of those arrangements, the intelligence behind it all. The few locals I've talked to about it just attribute it to bears or vandals, but I know what I saw. That thing was studying us, testing our reactions, showing off its strength and intelligence. It wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There was purpose behind everything it did. The precise timing, the careful arrangement of the corn, the way it made sure I saw it that night. It was sending a message. I still farm that land, but things are different now. I've installed security cameras and motion sensor lights, though deep down I know they wouldn't make a difference if it came back. Every harvest season, when the corn gets tall, I catch myself scanning the tree line, watching for movement. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear that deep rumble coming from the forest, like it's reminding me that it's still out there, watching, waiting. The hardest part isn't the fear or the uncertainty. It's knowing that something that intelligent, that purposeful, is living in our forests, and we're all pretending it doesn't exist. I don't know why it chose our farm, or what it wanted to show us, but I do know one thing. What I saw that night wasn't human, wasn't any known animal, and it fundamentally changed how I see the world around me. Story 14. October 12th, 2022. Started like any other day, setting up my gear in Shadow Valley. I'd been tracking movement patterns of local wildlife for a wildlife conservation project, particularly focusing on the elk population that frequents the area. The valley sits about 30 miles from the nearest town, and I'd set up my base camp near an old logging road that hadn't seen use in years. The morning was unusually foggy, with a heavy mist clinging to the ground. Temperature was around 45 degrees Celsius, and there was this eerie stillness in the air that I initially attributed to the weather. I had 8 trail cameras set up in a rough circle, covering about a quarter-mile of territory. These weren't cheap equipment either. We're talking high-end Reckonix cameras with night vision and motion sensors, the kind that can capture crystal-clear images of a deer moving at full sprint in pitch darkness. I remember checking my watch. It was 6:43 a.m. when I started my morning rounds to check the cameras and switch out memory cards. The first 2 cameras were fine, though I noticed something odd. There were fewer nighttime captures than usual. Typically, these cameras would catch dozens of animals during the night, but these only had a handful of shots, mostly of small creatures like raccoons and rabbits. The weird stuff started at the third camera. As I approached, I could see something was off. The camera, which I'd secured to a tree about 5 feet off the ground, was lying face up on a bed of leaves. At first I thought maybe a bear had knocked it down, but when I got closer, my blood ran cold. The camera hadn't been knocked down. It had been carefully placed on the ground, still perfectly intact. The mounting bracket had been unscrewed from the tree, not torn off. Whatever did this had fine motor skills and patience. That's when I noticed the smell. If you've ever been around wild animals, you know each has its distinct scent. But this was different. A powerful, musky odor that made my nose burn. It wasn't the rotting smell of a carcass or the typical scent of a bear. It was something else entirely, something I'd never encountered in all my years in the wilderness. As I checked the camera's footage, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the buttons. Most of the footage was normal until about 2:30 a.m. That's when I saw it. A massive dark figure moving through the frame. The infrared footage showed something bipedal, but the way it moved, it was too fluid, too agile for its size. I'm used to studying animal movements in footage, and this thing, whatever it was, moved with a grace that defied its bulk. The footage lasted only a few seconds before the camera was taken down. Moving to the fourth camera, my heart nearly stopped. It too was on the ground, placed with the same careful precision. Fifth camera, same thing. Sixth, seventh, and eighth, all the same. Whatever had done this had systematically gone through my entire setup during the night. The few cameras that still had power showed similar footage, brief glimpses of an enormous shadow moving with unsettling agility through the trees, but it was what I found near the last camera that really shook me. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint that made me question everything I thought I knew about the wildlife in these mountains. It was clearly a foot, not a paw, but it measured 17 inches from heel to toe. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy, but the shape, it was disturbingly humanoid, with 5 distinct toes and an arch like a human foot. As I was documenting the print with my handheld camera, I heard it. The sound started as a low whistle, but it wasn't like any bird call I'd ever heard. It was complex, almost musical, with changes in pitch and rhythm that seemed intelligent. It came from somewhere up the valley, maybe 500 yards away. Then another whistle answered from the opposite direction. They were communicating. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just those whistles echoing through the valley. Every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. But I forced myself to stay put and record the sounds on my phone. The whistles continued for about 3 minutes, getting more complex and varied. They weren't random. There was a clear pattern, like a conversation I couldn't understand. Then I heard the branch snap. It wasn't the sound of a dead branch falling. This was the sharp crack of fresh wood being broken. It came from behind me, maybe 100 feet into the dense forest. That's when the smell hit me again, stronger this time, and I heard heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. Whatever it was big enough to make the ground vibrate slightly with each step. I'd love to say I stayed to investigate further, but that would be a lie. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran back to my truck faster than I've ever moved in my life. The whole time, I could hear movement in the forest parallel to my path, keeping pace with me effortlessly. When I reached my truck, the whistles started again, closer this time, coming from multiple directions. I drove straight back to town and didn't return until the next day with 2 other photographers and a local forest ranger. We found my cameras exactly where they'd been left, still intact. The footprints were still there, and we took plaster casts. The ranger said he'd never seen anything like them in 20 years of service. What bothers me most isn't just what happened, but the intelligence behind it. Whatever was out there didn't destroy my cameras. It carefully disabled my observation of its territory. It demonstrated tool use by unscrewing the mounts. It showed complex communication abilities with those whistles, and most disturbing of all, it showed awareness of being watched and took deliberate action to prevent it. I've been back to Shadow Valley several times since then, always with other people. The cameras stay untouched now, but they never catch anything unusual anymore. Sometimes, though, usually around dawn, we hear those whistles in the distance, and occasionally that distinct musky smell drifts through the camp, reminding me that something out there is watching us far more carefully than we're watching it. I still do wildlife photography in the Pacific Northwest, but I've never forgotten what happened that morning. I've seen bears, cougars, and every other predator native to these forests, but nothing has ever displayed the level of intelligence and deliberate action I witnessed that day. Whatever it wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something that thought, planned, and acted with purpose. And sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing footage from my trail cameras, I find myself looking extra carefully at the shadows in the background, wondering if I'll catch another glimpse of what's really out there in our forests. Story 15. I've been struggling with whether or not to share this for a while now. What happened that day in Piney Woods completely changed how I see the world, and honestly I still have trouble processing it. I'm a pretty rational guy, been fishing all my life, worked as a park ranger for 15 years before switching careers, and I've never been one for crazy stories or conspiracy theories. But what happened that day in March 2019 defies any logical explanation I can come up with. Me and two of my buddies, Mark and Pete, had been planning this fishing trip for months. We'd heard Lake Livingston in the Piney Woods area was having an incredible bass season, and since we all needed a break from our daily routines, we decided to make a full day of it. We got there early, around 4:30 a.m., wanting to catch that perfect pre-dawn period when the big ones usually bite. The weather was unusually cool for Texas in March, probably in the low 50s, with this thick fog hanging over the lake. You know that kind of morning where everything's dead quiet and the fog just seems to swallow up every sound. That's exactly what it was like. We launched from a small boat ramp on the eastern shore, away from the more popular spots. The area was pretty remote, maybe a 20-minute drive from the nearest town, and the closest cabin or campsite was at least a mile away. We'd been fishing for about 2 hours, having decent luck, caught a few good-sized bass, nothing spectacular, but enough to keep us interested. Around 7 a.m., we decided to move to a different spot where Pete had gotten lucky the previous year. That's when things started getting weird. First thing we noticed was how the fish finder was acting up. I've been using fish finders for over 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like it. Instead of the usual scattered returns you'd expect, we were getting these massive solid readings moving in these bizarre patterns. Whatever it was big, way too big to be a catfish or alligator gar, and it was moving in ways that just didn't make sense. The object would disappear completely, then reappear in a totally different spot, moving faster than any fish I've ever tracked. Pete, who's usually pretty skeptical about everything, was the first one to say something felt off. The lake had gone completely still, not just quiet, but that unnatural kind of stillness that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just this heavy silence pressing in from all sides. We decided to pull up to the shore to check our gear and maybe grab some coffee from our cooler. That's when we noticed our tackle box and bait container weren't where we'd left them. We always set up our gear in a specific way, been doing it the same way for years. But now everything was different. About 50 yards down the shore, we found all our spare lures and bait, but they weren't scattered or messed up like you'd expect if an animal had gotten into them. They were stacked, actually stacked, in these perfect little piles, organized by type and size. I'm talking about dozens of lures and bait packages arranged with the kind of precision you'd see in a store display. Mark was the first one to spot the handprints in the mud. I say handprints, but that doesn't really do justice to what we saw. These things were massive. Each finger had to be at least 7 inches long, pressed deep into the clay-like mud near the water's edge. They were fresh too. Couldn't have been more than an hour old based on how the water was still seeping into them. That's when we heard it. This deep, rhythmic sound coming from the tree line. It wasn't like any animal call I've ever heard, and believe me, I've heard pretty much everything in these woods. It was more like a pulsing, almost mechanical sound, but somehow organic at the same time. The closest thing I can compare it to is maybe a cross between a whale song and a drum beat, but even that doesn't quite capture it. It was low enough that you could feel it in your chest, and it seemed to be moving, circling around our position. The fog was still pretty thick over the water, but it had started to lift a bit on shore. That's when Pete noticed something else. All the fish were gone. Not just not biting, but gone. The fish finder, which had been showing all kinds of crazy readings earlier, was now completely blank. In all my years of fishing, I've never seen anything like it. It was like every living thing in that part of the lake had just vanished. We started hearing movement in the underbrush about 100 yards inland. Heavy movement, the kind of sound that only comes from something big, really big. The trees in that area, mostly pines and some hardwoods, were swaying, but there wasn't any wind. Whatever was moving through there had to be massive to make those trees move like that. Then the smell hit us. If you've ever been around death or decay in the woods, you know that smell. But this was different. Yes, there was that rotting element to it, but also this powerful musky odor that burned the nose. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Mark actually threw up. We all kind of silently agreed it was time to leave. No words needed to be exchanged. We just started packing up as quickly and quietly as possible. That's when we heard the splash. About 200 yards out in the lake, something huge had just entered the water. The ripples were coming toward our boat, and fast. The fish finder suddenly lit up again, showing something massive moving under the surface, heading straight for us. I've never started an outboard motor so fast in my life. As we pulled away from the shore, that deep, pulsing sound got louder, and now it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. Through the fog, we could see movement on both the shore and in the water, but the mist was too thick to make out any clear shapes, just dark masses, way too big to be anything that should exist in those woods. We made it back to the boat ramp in record time. None of us spoke during the ride back. What could we say? Everything we'd just experienced went against everything we thought we knew about the natural world. As we were loading the boat onto the trailer, we heard that sound one last time, that deep, pulsating call, but this time it seemed to be coming from much further away, deeper in the woods. Later, when we finally worked up the courage to talk about it, we found we'd all noticed different details. Pete swears he saw a face watching us from the tree line right before we found the stacked lures, something dark and massive, way too high up to be a person. Mark can't get over how precisely our gear had been organized. He said it showed intelligence, planning. I can't shake the memory of those handprints in the mud and how the fingers seemed to have opposable thumbs, just like human hands, but massive. We never reported it officially. Who would we even tell? The game warden, the police. We'd sound crazy. We did go back about a week later, in a bigger group, and during the middle of the day. The handprints were gone, washed away by rain or tide. The strange smell had disappeared, and the fish were back like nothing had ever happened. If it weren't for the fact that all three of us experienced the same thing, I might have convinced myself it was some kind of mass hallucination. I still fish, but not in that spot. Something about that place changed that day. Or maybe my understanding of it changed. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what we experienced. Could it have been a group of bears? Some kind of elaborate prank? A gas leak making us hallucinate? None of these explanations quite fit what we saw and experienced. There's one detail I haven't told anyone else, not even Mark and Pete. As we were speeding away in the boat, I turned around for one last look through the fog. Just for a split second, the mist parted, and I saw something standing in the water. It was only visible for a moment, but what I saw has haunted my dreams ever since. A massive, dark figure, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, standing chest-deep in water that I know is at least 12 feet deep there. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. The proportions were all wrong, too big, too humanoid, but clearly not human. Before I could process what I was seeing, the fog closed back in, and it was gone. I've never been back to that specific spot on Lake Livingston, and I never will. Some things you experience in life defy explanation, and maybe they're better left that way. All I know is that whatever we encountered that morning wasn't something that's supposed to exist in our world, at least not according to any biology textbook I've ever read. The really unsettling part? Sometimes late at night, when I'm having trouble sleeping, I find myself wondering, did we stumble upon it by accident? Or did it want us to find those stacked lures? Was it trying to communicate something? And if it was, why? Story 16. I've been a forest ranger at Deep Creek for almost 8 years now, and what I experienced in March 2020 still haunts me. I've spent countless hours in these woods, and I thought I knew every inch of my patrol area. But that day showed me how wrong I was about what these forests might be hiding. It started during my routine morning patrol. The weather was unusually cold for early March, around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius, with a light dusting of snow from the night before. I was checking a less traveled section about 12 miles from the nearest access road when I noticed something odd about the tree line ahead. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A series of young aspens, each about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, were bent into perfect arches, creating what looked like a natural corridor. These weren't saplings, these were established trees, and someone or something had bent them with incredible force. The arches stretched for about 50 meters, all uniformly shaped, all pointing in the same direction. The rational part of my brain immediately tried to explain it. Maybe it was snow load? But no, these bends were too precise, too intentional. Heavy snow creates chaotic patterns, not this level of uniformity. Wind damage? The surrounding trees showed no signs of wind stress. As I stood there trying to make sense of it, I noticed the temperature dropping rapidly. I checked my equipment. The thermometer showed 20 degrees, 6 degrees. Just 100 yards back on the trail, it had been 35 degrees. That's when I saw the tracks. I've documented all kinds of wildlife prints in my career: elk, bear, mountain lion. But these were different. The impressions in the light snow were huge, about 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe marks. They followed a straight line along the corridor of bent trees, each step precisely placed, about 4 feet apart. The stride length alone suggested something massive. My training kicked in, and I started taking photos and measurements. But my hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from a growing sense of being watched. You develop a sixth sense in this job for when you're not alone in the woods. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just dead silence. Then I heard it. A sharp crack of wood on wood, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. It came from maybe 200 yards to my left. Before I could even turn my head, another crack responded from the opposite direction, then another from behind me. These weren't random sounds. They had a rhythm, a purpose. They were signals. I've heard all kinds of stories from other rangers about unexplained phenomena in the forests, but I'd always dismissed them. Standing there, surrounded by those methodically bent trees and listening to those coordinated wood knocks, I couldn't dismiss anything anymore. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. My equipment showed the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. The silence was absolute now, except for those continued knocking sounds, which seemed to be slowly closing in. Every instinct I had developed over my years in the forest was screaming at me to leave. That's when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something massive and dark moving between the trees about 100 yards away. I'm trained not to run from wildlife, but what I glimpsed wasn't like anything in our wildlife manuals. It was tall, at least 8 feet, moving with an unnatural smoothness through the dense forest. I didn't run. I forced myself to walk, keeping my movements deliberate and calm, even as my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over my footsteps. The knocking sounds followed me, keeping pace on both sides, but always just out of clear sight. As I reached the edge of that bizarre corridor of bent trees, I heard something that I'll never forget. A long, low vocalization that seemed to vibrate through my chest. It wasn't a bear's roar or an elk's bugle. It was almost human-like, but deeper than any human voice could possibly be, and it carried for what must have been miles. I made it back to my vehicle and immediately called it in. My supervisor came out with a team the next day. We documented everything, the bent trees, the tracks, which were starting to deteriorate in the melting snow, the unusual temperature variations. We set up trail cameras and sound monitoring equipment. But here's the thing. In the weeks that followed, we never captured anything definitive. The temperature anomaly persisted, consistently 15 degrees colder than the surrounding area. The wood knocks continued, always in that same call and response pattern, but only at night. But we never got clear footage of what was making them. The bent trees are still there. I've consulted with botanists and forestry experts. None can explain how something could exert enough force to bend trees that thick without breaking them, let alone do it in such a precise pattern. The force required would be massive, well beyond human capability without heavy machinery, and there were no track marks from any equipment. I still patrol that area, but never alone now. Sometimes, especially on quiet mornings, I'll hear those knocks in the distance, that same rhythmic pattern. The local wildlife still avoids that corridor. There's a roughly 100-yard dead zone where you won't see a single animal or bird. I've worked in these forests long enough to know that there are things out there we don't understand. I file my reports, take my measurements, and do my job. But I know what I saw that day. What I felt. Something intelligent created that corridor of bent trees, something that can move silently through dense forest, something strong enough to bend 6-inch thick trees like they were twigs, something that communicates through complex patterns of sounds. I don't tell this story much. It's not the kind of thing you bring up if you want to be taken seriously in my profession, but I know what I experienced. Those bent trees are still there. That cold spot persists, and on quiet nights, if you listen carefully, you can still hear those knocks echoing through the forest, calling to each other in some code we don't understand. Story 17. I've been studying birds in Silent Valley, Michigan for the past 8 years, and what happened last October still keeps me up at night. I'm a field researcher specializing in migratory patterns of songbirds, and I've always prided myself on being rational and methodical in my work. But what I experienced defies any logical explanation I can think of, and I still get chills remembering it. It started on October 12, 2021. I maintain several research stations throughout Silent Valley with specialized bird feeders equipped with cameras and weight sensors to track feeding patterns. That morning started like any other. I grabbed my gear, thermal coffee mug, and research journal before heading out to check my stations at 6:30 a.m. The autumn air was crisp, around 45 degrees, with a light fog hanging between the trees. Nothing seemed out of place during my drive to the first station. The first sign that something was wrong hit me when I pulled up to station number 3, about 4 miles into the dense forest area off Thompson Road. This station was my most active one, usually hosting around 200-300 bird visits daily. But that morning, there was complete silence. No chickadees, no nuthatches, not even the usual squirrels. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that unnatural silence is the first warning sign that something's off. I grabbed my equipment bag and walked toward the clearing where I had 3 feeders set up. That's when I stopped dead in my tracks. The feeders weren't there, at least not where they should have been. My heart started racing when I looked up and saw them perfectly arranged in a triangle formation about 30 feet up in a massive oak tree. These weren't simple feeders. Each one weighed about 15 pounds and had sensitive electronic equipment inside. They had been mounted on steel poles concreted into the ground. Someone, or something, had not only pulled these feeders out of the ground, but had carefully reassembled them high up in the tree, maintaining their exact spacing and orientation. The precision was what really got to me. This wasn't vandalism. The feeders were positioned with almost mathematical accuracy, forming a perfect equilateral triangle. Even the solar panels were angled correctly for maximum sun exposure. My hands were shaking as I took photos and notes. That's when I noticed the tracks. As a researcher, I'm used to identifying various animal prints, but these were different. They were clearly footprints, but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. What really disturbed me was the pattern. They circled the clearing in a perfect spiral, starting from the center where the feeders had been and moving outward. I counted 17 complete rotations, each print placed with precise spacing from the others. The prints were fresh, probably from the night before. The soil was still slightly damp from recent rain, preserving their detail. Each print showed clear toe impressions and a depth that suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Using my field calculator and basic physics, I estimated the creature would have to weigh at least 800 pounds to create impressions that deep in this soil type. Then the smell hit me. I've encountered pretty much every wild animal smell you can imagine in my years of field work, but this was different. It was a powerful, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I couldn't identify. Even with the morning breeze, the smell hung thick in the air. I've heard other researchers describe similar smells in alleged Bigfoot encounters, but I'd always dismissed those accounts as exaggerated. Now I was experiencing it firsthand, and it was overwhelmingly intense. I spent about 2 hours documenting everything, taking measurements, photos, soil samples, and trying to figure out how someone could have moved those feeders with such precision. The weird thing was, there were no tool marks on the feeders or poles, no rope marks on the tree bark, nothing to indicate how they'd been moved. The tree trunk was smooth, with no climbing aids or marks. Around 9:30 a.m., I decided to check my other stations. What I found was equally disturbing. Every station within a 2-mile radius was completely abandoned by birds. No activity on any of my motion sensors for the past 12 hours. This was unprecedented. Even during storms or when predators were around, we'd still get some activity. But there was absolutely nothing. I decided to set up a blind about 100 yards from station number 3 to observe the area. I had a good set of night vision binoculars and my research camera with a thermal imaging attachment. Something in my gut told me to stay and watch, even though every rational part of my brain was telling me to pack up and leave. As the day progressed, nothing unusual happened. The birds stayed away, but otherwise, it was just another quiet day in the woods. I made hourly walks around the perimeter, noting that the strange smell would intensify randomly, despite the wind direction remaining constant. At exactly 5:47 p.m., just as dusk was settling in, I heard the first branch snap. It came from the northeast, about 150 yards away. Then another snap, closer. These weren't the normal sounds of branches falling or breaking under their own weight. These were deliberate breaks, evenly spaced about 45 seconds apart. Whatever was causing them was moving in a straight line toward my position. I switched on my thermal imager, trying to keep my breathing steady. The breaking sounds continued, now accompanied by heavy footfalls that I could feel vibrating through the ground. That's when I saw it on the thermal display, a massive heat signature, easily 8 to 9 feet tall, moving between the trees with deliberate precision. The rational part of my brain shut down. The creature moved unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its gait was smooth, almost graceful despite its size. It stopped about 70 yards from my position, directly facing my blind. I know it knew I was there. I could feel it watching me. For the next 20 minutes, neither of us moved. The only sound was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then it did something that still haunts me. It reached up, probably 15 feet high, and deliberately snapped a thick branch. The crack echoed through the woods like a gunshot. Then another branch, same height, same deliberate motion. It was making a pattern, just like the footprints. I sat paralyzed as it continued this display, moving in a half circle around my position, breaking branches at precise intervals. The pattern was clear. It was demonstrating intelligence, showing me it wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. At 6:43 p.m., it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My thermal imager showed it standing completely still for exactly 3 minutes. Then, in a movement almost too fast to track, it turned and moved away through the forest, covering ground at an impossible speed for something that size. I waited another hour before I dared to move. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk back to my truck. The smell lingered in the air, stronger than ever, and I could see fresh tracks crossing my own footprints from earlier. Over the next 3 weeks, not a single bird returned to any of my stations within a 5-mile radius. The feeders remained in the tree. I couldn't bring myself to try and retrieve them. Every night at exactly 5:47 p.m., I would hear branches breaking in the distance, always in the same pattern, always moving in the same direction. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went back to normal. On November 4th, I arrived at my stations to find birds had returned overnight. The feeders were back in their original positions, reinstalled with the same precision they'd been moved with. The only evidence anything had happened were the spiral tracks, now barely visible in the soil, and a few fragments of the broken branches. I've spent months analyzing my data, photos and samples. I've compared notes with other researchers and locals. Some have shared similar experiences, though none as detailed or prolonged as mine. The official explanation from the university is that it was probably vandals, or maybe a bear, despite the impossibility of either explanation accounting for the precision and patterns I documented. I still do my research in Silent Valley. I had to. My entire PhD project is based there. But I've modified my equipment to transmit data remotely now. I don't stay past sunset anymore, and I've installed better cameras at all my stations. Sometimes when I'm reviewing the footage late at night, I catch glimpses of something moving between the trees. The images are always just blurry enough to be inconclusive, but the movement, that same deliberate, intelligent movement, I know what I saw. The strangest part, every October 12th since then, all my feeders are rearranged overnight, placed in that same triangle formation, 30 feet up in different trees. The spiral tracks reappear, and the birds vanish for exactly 3 weeks. It's like it's reminding me that it's still there, still watching, still demonstrating an intelligence that challenges everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I've never shared this story publicly before. My academic reputation would be ruined if I did. But I know what I experienced was real. The precision, the patterns, the deliberate demonstrations of intelligence. This wasn't just some undiscovered animal acting on instinct. Whatever I encountered that day was sophisticated, methodical, and wanted to communicate something. I just wish I knew what it was trying to tell us. Story 18. I run a small honey operation about 3 miles outside of town, near the edge of the Kettle Moraine State Forest. It's pretty isolated, just the way I like it. My nearest neighbor is about a mile down the road, and the closest thing to civilization is the old gas station at the highway junction. I've got about 30 hives spread across 2 acres, bordered by dense forest on 3 sides. That particular day started like any other. October 12th, 2018. I remember the date clearly because I was preparing for the last harvest before winter. The weather was unusually warm for October in Wisconsin, around 65 degrees Celsius, with a light breeze coming from the northwest. The leaves were just starting to turn, creating that perfect fall backdrop of reds and yellows against the evergreens. I'd been out checking the hives all afternoon, making sure they were ready for winter. Everything was normal. The bees were active but settling down as the sun started to set. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. That's the thing about beekeeping. You develop this sixth sense about your hives. You know their rhythm, their mood. Everything was exactly as it should be. Around 6:30 p.m., I headed back to my cabin, about 400 yards from the apiary. I always keep my equipment shed closer to the hives than my living space. It's just more practical that way. The sun was setting, and there was still enough light to see without a flashlight. I remember checking my phone. No service, as usual. Out here, you get used to being disconnected. That night, something woke me up around 2:15 a.m. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sound was different, more like a deep rhythmic humming or drumming coming from the direction of the hives. It wasn't mechanical. It had this organic quality to it that I can't really explain. The closest thing I can compare it to is when you're standing near those giant bass speakers at a concert and you feel the vibration in your chest. But this was different, more natural, if that makes any sense. I grabbed my flashlight and my old Remington 870. Out here, you don't investigate strange noises without protection. The moon was nearly full, but clouds were moving in, creating this weird, shifting light across the property. As I stepped outside, the first thing that hit me was the silence. Wisconsin nights are usually full of sound, crickets, owls, the wind in the trees. But that night, everything was dead quiet except for that rhythmic humming. The temperature had dropped significantly, probably into the low 40s, and there was this thick ground fog that had settled in, making everything look surreal. As I approached the apiary, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog, I noticed something odd about the hives. They looked wrong. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing. All 30 of my hives had been completely rearranged. Let me be clear, these aren't lightweight boxes. Each super, that's what we call the boxes that make up a hive, weighs anywhere from 50 to 90 pounds when full of honey. Moving one hive is a 2-person job. Moving 30, that's impossible in a single night without heavy equipment. But there they were, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, like a honeycomb itself, but on a massive scale. My hands were shaking as I got closer. The weird thing was, I couldn't hear any agitation from the bees. Normally, if you mess with hives at night, the bees get really upset. But they were eerily calm. That's when I noticed the handprints. They were pressed into the crystallized honey that had dripped down the sides of several hives. Massive handprints, easily twice the size of my own hand. They weren't smeared or messy. They were perfectly formed, like someone had deliberately pressed their huge hands into the honey. The prints showed clear dermal ridges, like fingerprints but massive. Some of them were over 12 inches from palm to fingertip. The humming was louder now, and I could feel it in my teeth. It was coming from the forest edge, maybe 50 yards away. My flashlight beam caught movement in the trees, but the fog made it impossible to see clearly. What I did see made my blood run cold. Something large moving between the trees, something that seemed to be walking upright. That's when I noticed the footprints. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there was a perfect circle of tracks around the entire apiary. Each print was about 15 inches long and incredibly deep. Whatever made them had to weigh hundreds of pounds. They weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were too human-like, but massive. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was terrified. But I'm also a beekeeper, and those hives represent my livelihood. I forced myself to check the nearest hive, expecting to find it damaged or the bees agitated. Instead, I found something impossible. The hive was perfectly intact, and the bees were completely calm. In fact, they were exhibiting behavior I'd never seen before. They were moving in synchronized patterns, almost like they were dancing in time with that weird humming. The sound suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. That's when I heard it. Heavy breathing coming from the tree line, and the distinct crack of a massive branch breaking under significant weight. My flashlight beam caught something that still appears in my nightmares. A pair of eyes reflecting back at me from about 8 feet off the ground. They weren't like any animal eyes I'd ever seen. They had an intelligence to them, an awareness that made my skin crawl. I'd love to say I stood my ground, but that would be a lie. I backed away slowly at first, then turned and ran back to my cabin faster than I've ever moved in my life. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my kitchen, shotgun across my lap, staring out the window. The humming never returned, but twice more I heard heavy footsteps moving around outside. When dawn finally came, I went back out to the apiary. The hives were still in that perfect geometric pattern. The footprints were still there, though already starting to fade as the ground dried. The handprints in the crystallized honey were clear as day. I took photos of everything, but somehow they all came out blurry or distorted, every single one. Here's the strangest part. My honey production that year was the highest it's ever been, by almost double. The bees remained unusually calm and organized for weeks afterward. Even now, years later, those hives produce more honey than any others in the area. I've tried to find rational explanations. Could it have been an elaborate prank? Impossible. No group of people could have moved those hives so perfectly without disturbing the bees. Some kind of animal. Nothing around here could make those prints or explain the geometric arrangement. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and I still can't explain what happened that night. I haven't told many people about this. Who would believe it? A few local beekeepers have commented on how unusually productive my hives are, and I've noticed other strange things since then. Broken branches way too high up in the trees, that same humming sound in the distance on particularly quiet nights. And sometimes when I'm working with the hives, I get the distinct feeling I'm being watched. Whatever visited my apiary that night seemed to have a purpose. It wasn't random destruction or curiosity. It was deliberate, organized, and somehow connected to the bees. I've researched similar incidents and found a few vague references to Native American legends about tall ones who had special relationships with bees, but nothing concrete. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm out checking the hives, I still hear that humming in the distance. The bees get calm, almost expectant, but nothing else has happened. It's like whatever it was just wanted to reorganize things, maybe make them better. I don't know. What I do know is that my understanding of what's possible, of what exists in our forests, changed forever that night. I still keep bees in the same spot. The hives are still arranged in that geometric pattern. I never moved them back. Something tells me I shouldn't. The honey production remains exceptional, and the bees seem healthier than ever. But I don't stay out there after dark anymore, and I've installed security cameras. Though, strangely, They never seem to work quite right on foggy nights. Story 19. I was conducting a geological survey of some lesser-known limestone formations about 12 miles from the nearest access road. The area had some interesting karst topography I wanted to document, and I'd gotten permission from the Forest Service to explore some newly discovered cave systems. The weather was unusually warm for September, around 75 degrees, with a light breeze and clear skies, perfect conditions for field work. I'd been mapping and taking samples since early morning, marking GPS coordinates and documenting the rock strata. Around 2 p.m., I noticed an opening in the limestone cliff face that wasn't on any of my maps. It was partially obscured by brush, which explained why it might have been missed by previous surveys. The entrance was about 7 feet high and 5 feet wide, large enough to walk into without crouching. The first thing that struck me as odd was the complete absence of wildlife near the cave entrance. Usually you'll see signs of rodents, bats, or at least insects, but there was nothing. The ground around the entrance was unusually clear too, like something had been regularly moving in and out. I noticed some broken branches on the surrounding bushes, all snapped at roughly the same height, about 8 feet up. I've explored hundreds of caves, so I followed standard protocol, checked air quality with my meter, put on my helmet with LED lamp, made sure my backup lights were working, and radioed my location to base camp, though the signal was pretty weak out there. I had my usual gear, sample bags, rock hammer, camera, GPS unit, and emergency supplies in my backpack. The moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The temperature dropped significantly, more than usual for a cave entrance, and there was this smell. Not the typical musty cave smell, but something musky and organic, almost like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but stronger than anything I'd encountered before. My first thought was maybe a mountain lion had died inside, but this smell was different. About 30 feet in, I noticed the first strange markings on the walls. As a geologist, I'm trained to identify natural rock formations and erosion patterns. These weren't natural. They were parallel sets of deep grooves, clearly carved into the limestone. What really caught my attention was their consistency. They were all exactly the same height off the ground, roughly 8 feet up. I measured them with my laser distance meter to be sure. The grooves were about 2 inches deep and 4 inches long, appearing in groups of 4. They looked like claw marks, but much larger than any bear or mountain lion could make. My equipment started acting strange too. My GPS unit, which was working perfectly outside, began showing random coordinates. My digital camera would turn on and off by itself, and my LED headlamp started flickering intermittently. I switched to my backup light, but it was having similar issues. The deeper I went into the cave, the worse the interference became. Then I heard it, a rhythmic thumping sound echoing through the cave passages. At first, I thought it might be water dripping, but the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. It was like someone slowly beating on a hollow log. Thump, thump, thump. Every 12 seconds exactly. I timed it on my watch. The cave tunnel went about 200 feet before opening into a larger chamber. What I found there still gives me nightmares. The chamber was roughly circular, about 40 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling rising about 15 feet high. But it was what was inside that made my blood run cold. In the center of the chamber was what I can only describe as a nest. Not like any animal nest I've ever seen. This was massive, probably 12 feet in diameter, made from intricately woven tree branches, some as thick as my arm. The branches weren't just piled up, they were methodically intertwined, showing clear signs of intelligence in their construction. Some of the branches still had fresh leaves on them, suggesting recent activity. The ground around the nest was packed hard, like something heavy had been walking the same paths over and over. And the footprints? God, the footprints. I've seen bear tracks, elk tracks, every kind of wildlife track you can imagine in Wyoming. These were different. They were clearly bipedal, roughly 17 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. They were deeply pressed into the hard cave floor, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The footprints formed a clear pattern of movement, from the nest to various points around the chamber and back to the entrance tunnel. I took out my camera to document them, but it wouldn't turn on at all now. My phone camera worked briefly, but the pictures came out too dark and blurry to be useful. The thumping sound was louder in here, seeming to come from somewhere deeper in the cave system. There was another tunnel leading off the chamber, but something inside me screamed not to go any further. The smell was overpowering now, and the air felt heavy, like right before a thunderstorm. That's when I noticed something that made me realize I needed to get out immediately. The thumping had stopped. The silence was absolute, oppressive. And then I heard something that still haunts my dreams, a deep, rumbling breath from somewhere in that back tunnel. It wasn't an echo or my imagination. Something was in there, something big. I'd love to say I made a careful, professional exit, but that would be a lie. I got out of there as fast as I could while still being safe. The tunnel felt twice as long on the way out. My lights were barely working, but I could see enough to move. I swear the breathing sounds followed me, always just far enough behind that I couldn't see what was making them. When I finally reached the entrance, I noticed something that hadn't registered on my way in. Fresh claw marks on the walls near the entrance, still powdery with limestone dust. Whatever made them had done so very recently, possibly while I was inside. I made it back to my vehicle and left the area immediately. When I got back to cell phone range, I found my phone had dozens of photos I hadn't taken, all of them completely black, except for a few that showed blurry sections of the cave wall or floor. I reported the cave location to the Forest Service, marking it as a potential hazard area due to unstable rock formations. I didn't mention what I'd really found. Who would believe me? I've gone back twice since then with other geologists, but we've never been able to find the entrance again. The GPS coordinates from that day are corrupted in my unit, showing impossible locations. The craziest part. About a week after my experience, I was reviewing some old geological surveys of the area from the 1950s. One report mentioned finding unusually large, artificially constructed structures in caves in the region, but the coordinates and detailed descriptions were mysteriously missing from the official records. I still work as a geologist, but I don't do solo cave surveys anymore. Sometimes at night I can still hear that rhythmic thumping in my dreams, and I wake up smelling that musky organic odor. I know what I found wasn't natural, wasn't something that should exist. But it does, and it's out there in Thunder Basin, doing whatever it does in that carefully constructed nest, leaving its methodical marks exactly 8 feet high on cave walls. I've spent my career studying evidence left in stone over millions of years, but what I found that day in Thunder Basin, those fresh marks, that massive nest, those footprints, that was evidence of something alive now, something intelligent, something that shouldn't exist but does. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's still there, marking time with its rhythmic thumping, waiting for someone else to stumble into its domain. Story 20. I never really believed in any of that Bigfoot stuff before. Sure, I'd heard the stories growing up in North Carolina, but I always figured they were just tall tales people made up to scare kids or get attention. That all changed in October 2019, and I still get goosebumps every time I think about what happened on my farm in Whispering Pines. I've been running this farm for about 15 years now. It's nothing huge, just 40 acres of corn and soybeans, plus a small stable with 4 horses I keep for trail riding. The property backs up against the Uwharrie National Forest, which always gave me a nice sense of privacy. Well, at least it used to. It started on October 12th. I remember the date clearly, because it was the day after my daughter's birthday. I woke up early like usual, around 5 a.m., to start my morning routine. The moment I stepped onto my back porch with my coffee, something felt wrong. You know that feeling when the air just feels different, like there's a storm coming, but the sky is clear. That's what it was like. My dogs, I have 2 German shepherds, were acting weird too. Usually they'd be running around the yard, eager to start their day. But that morning, they just sat on the porch, staring toward the cornfield, their ears perked forward. They wouldn't budge when I called them. As the sky started getting lighter, I could see why. All my scarecrows, and I had 8 of them spread across the field, were gone from their posts. At first, I thought maybe some teenagers had pulled a prank, but my security lights hadn't gone off during the night, and those things are sensitive enough to trigger when a raccoon walks by. I grabbed my flashlight, even though it was getting light out, old habit, and walked out to check the damage. The morning dew had settled on everything, making my boots wet as I walked through the field. That's when I found them, all 8 scarecrows, carefully taken apart and stacked in the middle of the field. Not thrown in a pile like vandals would do, but meticulously organized. The poles were lined up by length, the clothes were folded, actually folded, and stacked by size, and even the hay stuffing was gathered in neat piles. But that wasn't the weirdest part. Around this bizarre display was a perfect spiral of footprints, like whatever made them had walked around and around the pile, getting closer with each circle. These weren't human footprints. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, and deeper than any prints I'd ever seen a person make. The spiral pattern started about 20 feet out from the pile and worked its way in. The ground was soft from recent rain, so the prints were clear as day. The smell hit me next. If you've ever been around wild animals, you know that musky, wild smell they have. This was like that, but stronger and different. Kind of like wet dog mixed with rotting leaves and something else I can't even describe. It was strongest near the scarecrow pile and seemed to follow the spiral of footprints. I'll admit it, I was scared. Not the kind of scared you get from watching a horror movie, but that deep, primal fear that makes your gut clench. I took some pictures with my phone, though my hands were shaking so bad most of them came out blurry. I started heading back to the house to call someone. The police. Animal control. Who do you even call for something like this? That's when my horses started going crazy in the stable. I could hear them kicking the walls and whinnying in panic. I ran over to check on them, and they were drenched in sweat, eyes rolling wild. When I tried to lead them out for their morning pasture time, they flat out refused. These horses have been with me for years, and I've never seen them act like this. They wouldn't go anywhere near the cornfield. Throughout the day, I kept trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was an elaborate prank. Maybe some kind of animal behavior I'd never heard of. I called my neighbor, Tom, who's lived here for 30 years, to ask if he'd ever seen anything like it. He came over to look, and I've never seen a man's face go so pale. He told me about strange things he'd heard in the forest over the years, but nothing like this. As the day went on, things got weirder. Birds wouldn't land in that field. My dogs refused to go near it. I tried to work on other parts of the farm, but I kept getting this feeling of being watched. You know when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? It was like that all day long. Then came sunset. I was in the barn getting ready to close up for the night when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind through the trees, but there was no breeze that evening. It was a sound I still can't properly describe, kind of like someone playing a flute, but deeper and more organic. It was musical but wrong somehow, like hearing a familiar song played in a key that shouldn't exist. It was coming from the forest edge, near where my property meets the Uwharrie. I stood there listening for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The sound would fade away and then come back stronger, sometimes seeming to come from different directions. My security lights kept flickering on and off at the edge of the property, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. That night, I brought my dogs inside. They didn't argue, locked every door and window, and loaded my shotgun. I sat in my living room with all the lights off, watching the field through my window. Around 2 a.m., the security lights went off again. In the harsh artificial light, I saw something move at the forest's edge. It was huge. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was just a silhouette, but I could see it was covered in dark hair, and it moved in a way that was almost human, but not quite right. The light clicked off after a few seconds, and when it came back on, whatever it was had vanished. That musical sound came again, closer this time, and then complete silence fell over the entire farm. Not normal nighttime quiet, absolute silence. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, everything was back to normal, like someone had flipped a switch. The birds were singing, my horses were calm, and that strange smell was gone. The footprints were still there, but they'd started to fade from the morning dew. I've tried to tell myself there must be some logical explanation, but I know what I saw and heard. I ended up taking down all my scarecrows permanently. I've installed more security lights and cameras, but nothing like that has happened again. Sometimes, though, usually around dusk, I'll hear that strange musical sound drifting from the forest, and my horses will get nervous, and that musky smell will drift across the field. I've lived in North Carolina my whole life, and I know what bears and other wildlife sound and smell like. This was something else entirely. I don't tell many people about what happened. Who'd believe it? But I know what I experienced, and I'll never forget it. Whatever it was, it seemed intelligent. The way those scarecrows were organized, that spiral pattern of footprints, it wasn't random destruction. It was deliberate, like it was trying to send a message. I still farm that field, but I don't work there after sunset anymore, and sometimes when I'm out there alone, I still get that feeling of being watched. I've learned to listen when my animals act strange, and I keep my shotgun closer than I used to. Whatever visited my farm that night, I have a feeling it's still out there in the Uwharrie forest, watching and waiting. For what? I don't know, and I hope I never find out. Story 21. I've been hesitating to share this for over 2 years now. What happened to me in Shadow Creek still keeps me up some nights, and I'm not even sure how to explain it without sounding crazy. I'm a wildlife photographer, or I was, until October 2021. I mostly did contract work for nature magazines and conservation groups, spending weeks at a time in remote locations to document wildlife behavior. The Shadow Creek assignment was supposed to be straightforward: document the return of moose populations to northern Maine after some successful conservation efforts. I'd set up my base camp about 15 miles outside of Shadow Creek proper. The locals had mentioned increased moose activity in that area, particularly around an old-growth section of forest that had somehow survived the logging operations from the previous century. I had a pretty solid setup. 3 high-end trail cameras with motion sensors, night vision capabilities, and cellular connectivity to upload images to my laptop. I'd positioned them in what I thought was a perfect triangle around a clearing where I'd spotted some heavy moose traffic based on tracks and droppings. The first 2 days were completely normal. I got some decent shots of deer, a few foxes, and even a black bear wandering through. No moose yet, but that's pretty typical. It usually takes a few days to get the money shots. I had my main camp about half a mile from the cameras, close enough to check them easily, but far enough not to disturb any wildlife activity. The weather was typical for Maine in early October, mid-40s during the day, dropping to the low 30s at night. Clear skies, light wind, perfect conditions for photography. Everything changed on the 3rd night. I remember checking my watch when I first woke up, 2:17 a.m. What woke me wasn't a sound exactly, but more like the absence of sound. Anyone who's spent time in the woods knows they're never truly silent, even at night. There's always something: crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals. But at that moment, it was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I lay there in my sleeping bag, suddenly wide awake, every nerve in my body screaming that something wasn't right. Then I heard it, a sound that still haunts me. It was like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk, but much deeper, more resonant. Thoom. Then silence. Maybe 30 seconds later, another thoom, but this time from a different direction, maybe a quarter mile away. Then a third thoom from yet another direction. My first thought was bears. They sometimes mark territory by clawing trees, but this was different. The sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic, and they seemed to be responding to each other, almost like communication. For the next hour, I lay completely still, listening to this bizarre percussion concert in the darkness. The sequence was always the same: 3 distinct locations, always in the same order, with almost exactly the same timing between beats. When dawn finally came, I was still awake, my sleeping bag damp with sweat despite the cold. I waited until the sun was fully up before leaving my tent. The morning felt wrong somehow, unusually cold, with a strange heaviness to the air. I grabbed my camera gear and headed out to check on my trail cams, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. I noticed something was off before I even reached the first camera. The ground felt different, colder. Not just morning in Maine cold, but unnaturally cold, like standing next to an industrial freezer. As I got closer to where I'd set up my first camera, I stopped dead in my tracks. The camera wasn't where I'd left it. It had been carefully, and I mean carefully, moved about 6 feet to the left, now pointing at this massive old oak tree I hadn't paid much attention to before. My hands were shaking as I checked the camera. It was still working, still properly secured to its mount, just relocated. The footage showed normal wildlife activity until about 2 a.m., then static for a few minutes, then it was suddenly in its new position. Something had moved it without triggering the motion sensor or damaging the equipment. I rushed to check the second camera. Same thing, moved about 8 feet, pointing at the same damn tree. Third camera? You guessed it. All 3 cameras had been repositioned to focus on this one specific tree, forming a perfect triangle around it. The precision was what got to me. This wasn't random vandalism or animals messing with the equipment. This was deliberate, calculated. That's when I noticed the marks on the tree. At first, I thought they were bear scratches, but as I got closer, my blood ran cold. They were handprints. Massive, human-like handprints pressed into the bark about 9 feet up the trunk. Each print was easily twice the size of my hand, with distinct finger marks. The bark wasn't torn or scratched like you'd see with bear marks. It was like something with enormous hands had just grabbed the tree hard enough to leave impressions. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked a bit. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but it was dead. Fully charged the night before, now completely drained. My handheld camera still worked, though, and I managed to get several shots of the handprints and the repositioned cameras. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. You know that sensation when someone's staring at you? Multiply that by about 1,000. The temperature around the tree was bizarre. I had a small thermometer in my gear bag that I sometimes used to track weather conditions for my photography notes. Standing about 20 feet from the tree, it read 43 degrees, pretty normal for that time of day. But as I walked closer to the tree, it dropped steadily. Right next to the trunk, it showed 28 degrees, a 15-degree difference in just 20 feet on a clear, sunny morning. I started gathering my camera gear as quickly as I could, trying to keep my eyes on the surrounding forest. That's when the wood knocking started again, in broad daylight. Thoom. Same deep, resonant sound from the night before. I froze, camera bag half-packed, waiting. Thoom. The second knock came from behind me, maybe 100 yards away. I didn't wait for the third one. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran like hell back to my camp. I threw everything into my truck so fast I broke one of my tripods. The whole time, those knocks kept coming, maintaining their perfect rhythm, but seeming to get closer. I could feel the temperature dropping around me as I worked. The drive back to town is mostly a blur. I remember checking my rearview mirror constantly, convinced I was going to see something following me. When I finally got back to Shadow Creek, I went straight to the local ranger station. The ranger on duty, Dave Morrison, listened to my story with an increasingly concerned expression. He radioed another ranger to go check out the site. They found my cameras, still pointing at the tree. The handprints were there too. They took pictures and measurements. But here's the thing that still bothers me the most. The temperature difference was gone. The rangers checked with multiple instruments, and the temperature around the tree was completely normal. The bark where I'd seen the handprints looked older somehow, like the impressions had been there for years rather than hours. I've got the photos, though, both from my camera and the ones the rangers took. The handprints are clear as day, and you can see how my cameras were repositioned. I've shown them to a few experts, biologists, forensics people. No one can explain what could make marks like that, or why something would carefully move cameras instead of just destroying them. I sent the memory cards from my trail cameras to a friend who does video forensics. The gap in the footage where the cameras were moved is weird. It's not like they were turned off or covered up. It's like time just skipped between their original positions and their new ones. I haven't gone back to wildlife photography since then. I tried about a month later in a completely different state, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I heard a tree branch crack or felt a cold spot in the woods, I'd pack up and leave. The weird thing is, after I left Shadow Creek that day, there have been 5 other reports from that same area, all describing similar things. Wood knocking sounds in perfect sequences, unexplained cold spots. And most recently, 2 hikers found their camping gear rearranged overnight, all pointing toward that same damn tree. I still have nightmares about those handprints, not because they were scary by themselves, but because of what they implied. Something intelligent enough to carefully move cameras without damaging them, strong enough to leave permanent marks in solid oak, and deliberate enough to create a perfect geometric pattern, and I never saw what it was. Sometimes I wonder if that's the part that really scares me, not what I saw, but what I didn't see, what might have been watching me the whole time. The rangers keep a file on the Shadow Creek incidents now. Last I heard, they've documented over 20 cases of unexplained wood knocking in specific patterns, all within a 2-mile radius of that tree. They've brought in wildlife experts, set up their own cameras, even did thermal imaging surveys. They haven't found anything conclusive, but they did note one interesting detail. Every time someone reports the knocking sounds, the temperature in that section of forest drops by at least 10 degrees. I don't know what was out there in Shadow Creek. I don't want to know. But I do know this. Something intelligent was trying to communicate. Those perfectly timed knocks, the carefully repositioned cameras, the geometric precision of it all. That wasn't random animal behavior. That was a message. I just hope I never find out what it was trying to say. Story 22. I've been a maple syrup producer in Quiet Valley, Vermont for almost 15 years now. What happened last winter shook me to my core, and I still can't make sense of it. I've debated sharing this for months, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. It was mid-February 2022, during what should have been a normal tapping season. The temperatures were perfect. below freezing at night and above freezing during the day, creating that pressure difference we need for the sap to flow. I have about 2,000 taps spread across 40 acres of sugar maple forest that's been in my family for generations. That morning started like any other during sugaring season. I got up before dawn, around 4:30 a.m., to check the lines and make sure everything was flowing properly. We use a modern vacuum tubing system. All the trees are connected with food-grade plastic tubing that runs to central collection tanks. It's not the old-fashioned bucket method anymore, but it's much more efficient. The temperature that morning was brutal, around 15 degrees, 26 degrees C. I bundled up in my heaviest winter gear and grabbed my usual equipment: headlamp, multi-tool, spare tubing sections, and my trusty thermos of coffee. I also had my phone and a small digital thermometer I used to check sap temperatures. The first sign that something was wrong hit me as soon as I stepped onto my back porch. The usual pre-dawn chorus of winter birds was completely absent. In February, you'd typically hear black-capped chickadees or northern cardinals, even in the cold. But there was nothing, just this heavy, pressing silence that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the unease and started my usual route through the sugar bush. Everything seemed normal for the first few minutes as I checked the main collection tanks near the sugar house. But as I moved deeper into the woods, following one of the main sap lines, I noticed something odd about the tubing layout. Someone, or something, had completely reorganized large sections of my tubing system overnight. And I don't mean they were just tangled or broken. The tubes had been methodically disconnected and reconnected in perfectly straight lines, creating geometric patterns I'd never seen before. Some sections formed exact 90-degree angles, others created perfect parallel lines, spanning between trees that weren't even part of the same collection system originally. My first thought was vandalism, but this didn't make any sense. Who would break into a maple farm in the middle of a freezing February night just to reorganize tubing? And the precision was impossible. Some of these lines stretched for hundreds of feet in perfectly straight paths, ignoring the natural contours of the land. It would have taken a professional surveying team with laser equipment to achieve this kind of geometric precision. Then I noticed the footprints. They were enormous, easily 18 inches long and about 8 inches wide. But what really frightened me was their pattern. Like the tubing, they formed perfectly straight lines through the snow, maintaining exact distances between each step. No human walks like that, especially not through 2 feet of snow in the dark. The stride length was massive too, at least 6 feet between each print. I followed one set of prints with my headlamp, and that's when I noticed the temperature anomaly. Every collection tank along these reorganized lines was significantly warmer than it should have been. Typically, the sap comes out of the trees at just above freezing, maybe 33 to 34 degree Celsius. But my digital thermometer was reading 75 degree Celsius in some tanks. That's impossible. The sap would have started to ferment at that temperature, but it hadn't. It was still fresh and clear. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard it. A deep, rhythmic thrumming sound coming from the canopy above. It wasn't mechanical. It had an organic quality to it, almost like a massive heartbeat, but with complex overlapping patterns. The sound seemed to move through the trees, shifting position in ways that defied physics. Sometimes it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Other times it would snap to a single location with impossible precision. The vibrations were so intense they made my chest cavity resonate. I could feel my teeth chattering, but not from the cold. The sound had a pattern to it, 3 long pulses, followed by 2 short ones, then a pause. This sequence repeated over and over, getting louder and more complex. I noticed that none of the usual forest creatures were around. No squirrels, no birds, not even tracks from the deer that usually move through the area at night. It was like every animal for miles had suddenly decided to avoid this section of forest. I pulled out my phone to try and record the sound, but it wouldn't turn on. The battery had been at 98% when I left the house, and it's rated for extreme cold. But now it was completely dead. My headlamp started flickering too, even though I'd just put fresh batteries in it that morning. The thrumming suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. That's when I heard the breathing. Deep, slow breaths that sounded like they were coming from something massive. I slowly turned around, and there it was, standing about 50 yards away between two maple trees. It was hard to make out its exact shape in the pre-dawn darkness, but what I could see didn't make sense. It was tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear or any other animal I know. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long. It was covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb my headlamp's light rather than reflect it. But its eyes, God, its eyes. They caught just enough light to show a deep amber color, with an intelligence behind them that froze me in place. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. Whatever I was looking at knew exactly what it was doing. The creature stood completely still, watching me. Then it slowly raised one massive arm and pointed at one of the reorganized sap lines. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. That's when I noticed that all the geometric patterns in the tubing seemed to center on that spot, like some kind of massive diagram or symbol. My headlamp chose that moment to die completely. In the seconds it took me to pull out my backup flashlight, the creature vanished. There was no sound of movement, no tracks showing where it went. It was just gone. I ran back to the sugar house as fast as I could through the deep snow. By the time I got there, the sky was starting to lighten. I called the police, but when they came out later that morning, things had changed. The tubing was still reorganized, but the patterns weren't as perfect as they had been in the darkness. The footprints were still there, but they'd started to melt and distort in the morning sun. The officers took photos and measurements, but they clearly didn't know what to make of it. They suggested maybe some local kids had played a prank, or that the weird patterns were just tricks of light and shadow on the snow. But they couldn't explain the footprints, or why my phone and headlamp had both failed simultaneously. The temperature in the collection tanks had returned to normal by sunrise. The birds and animals gradually returned over the next few days. I spent weeks trying to reorganize my tubing system back to its original layout. The maple syrup we produced from that day's sap run was different. Not bad, just different. It had an unusual depth of flavor that I've never tasted before or since. I still have a bottle of it that I can't bring myself to open. I've been in these woods my entire life. I know every tree, every rock, every slope. What I saw that morning wasn't natural. The precise geometric patterns, the impossible footprints, the rhythmic sounds, it all felt like some kind of deliberate communication. But what was it trying to tell me? And why choose my sugar bush, my maple trees? Sometimes on cold mornings, I still hear that deep thrumming sound in the distance. The patterns have never reappeared, and I haven't seen the creature again. But I know it's still out there. The animals sense it too. There are still days when the forest goes completely silent, and I know it's watching. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know that something intelligent and absolutely not human took an interest in my maple farm that night. I just wish I knew why. Story 23. I work as a site supervisor at one of the smaller quartzite excavation operations just outside Crystal Falls, Minnesota. It's not a big operation, just me and a crew of 4 others working the day shift, plus 2 guys handling the night security. The mine itself is pretty standard. We've got about 300 acres of permitted area, with active excavation happening in roughly a quarter of that. What makes this site special is the quality of the quartzite we extract, some of the clearest specimens in the state. It was October 15th, 2017. I remember the date clearly because we were rushing to complete our quarterly extraction quota before the weather turned. Minnesota winters aren't kind to mining operations, and we needed every working day we could get. I'd arrived early that morning around 5:30 a.m. to do some preliminary site checks before the crew arrived at 7. The air was crisp, probably around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, with that distinctive fall chill that seems to carry smells farther than usual. There was just enough pre-dawn light to see without my flashlight as I did my walkthrough of the main extraction area. Everything seemed normal at first. The excavator was where we'd left it, tools were secured in the site office, and the security logs showed nothing unusual from the night shift. That changed when I reached the northwest section of the pit. We'd been working that area heavily the previous week, following a particularly rich vein of high-grade quartzite. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. Right in the center of our main extraction point was something that couldn't have been there. It was a pile of quartzite crystals, but not just randomly dumped there. These were arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, with larger specimens on the outside gradually decreasing in size as they spiraled inward. The crystals were cleaned, not a speck of dirt on them, and positioned with a precision that made my skin crawl. We're talking about maybe 60 or 70 pieces, ranging from fist-sized chunks down to pieces no bigger than my thumb, all arranged in this unnervingly perfect pattern. My first thought was that someone was messing with us. Maybe one of the night security guys got bored. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Around the spiral of crystals was a perfect circle of footprints pressed into the hard-packed earth. These weren't human footprints. They were massive, easily 15 inches long and deeper than any human print could be. The circle was exact, like it had been drawn with a compass, with each footprint precisely the same distance from the center and from each other. I've been around heavy machinery all my life, but I've never seen anything that could make prints like that in such a perfect circle. And there were no other tracks leading to or from the circle. It was like whatever made them had appeared out of nowhere, walked in a perfect circle, and then vanished. The smell hit me next. Anyone who's worked in mines knows there are all sorts of smells: earth, diesel, blasting residue. But this was different. It was a powerful, musky odor, like wet fur mixed with something metallic. It was strongest near the crystal formation and seemed to hang in the air like a fog. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but it wouldn't turn on. It had been fully charged when I left home, but now it was completely dead. I went back to my truck to get my camera. We keep one in the site office for documenting our finds. Same thing, it wouldn't power up. Even my flashlight, which I'd just put fresh batteries in the day before, was dead. That's when I heard it. From deep in the mine shaft we'd been excavating, there came a sound that I still have trouble describing. It was like metal striking metal, but with a rhythm to it. 3 quick hits, pause, 2 slow hits, pause, repeat. It wasn't the random noise of settling rocks or equipment cooling down. This was deliberate, almost like communication. I'm not easily spooked, but something about this situation felt deeply wrong. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but I knew I needed to document this somehow. I ran back to my truck and grabbed my notebook and pen, at least those couldn't die on me, and started sketching what I was seeing and taking notes. The sounds continued for about 20 minutes, always in that same pattern. 3 quick, 2 slow, 3 quick, 2 slow. Then they started getting closer to the surface. That's when I noticed the temperature around the crystal formation had dropped significantly. My breath was now visible in the air, but only within about a 10-foot radius of the spiral. As the sun started to rise, casting more light into the pit, I noticed something else about the footprints. They weren't just impressions in the dirt. The earth inside each print had been compacted so hard it was almost crystallized. I've seen what happens when our heaviest equipment runs over ground, and this was different. The compression pattern suggested whatever made these prints had to weigh at least 800 to 1,000 pounds. Around 6:45 a.m., just before the crew was due to arrive, everything changed. The metallic sound suddenly stopped. The temperature around the formation returned to normal almost instantly, and the musty smell vanished like someone had flipped a switch. By the time my crew arrived at 7, the only evidence anything unusual had happened were the crystal spiral and those massive footprints. I had my crew document everything before we disturbed the site. The strange effects on electronic equipment persisted throughout the day, but only within about 20 feet of the formation. Any device brought into that radius would immediately die, only to start working normally again when taken away. We tried to continue normal operations in other parts of the pit, but throughout the day, strange things kept happening. Tools would go missing and turn up in bizarre places. We'd hear that metallic tapping sound echoing from different parts of the mine, but never could locate the source. And every animal in the area, birds, squirrels, even the usually ever-present mine rats, had completely vanished. The footprints proved impossible to cast. Any plaster we poured into them would refuse to set, remaining liquid until we scooped it out. When we tried to photograph them from different angles, every camera would malfunction. Even measuring them properly became a challenge because metal measuring tapes would go completely slack when extended over them, like they were being affected by some kind of magnetic field. That night, I made the decision to stay late, long after my crew had gone home. I set up a simple observation post in my truck, about 50 feet from the formation. Around 9:30 p.m., the temperature started dropping again, and that metallic sound returned. But this time, it was different, faster, more urgent. The crystal spiral began to emit a faint, pulsing glow, barely visible, but definitely there. What happened next is something I've tried to rationalize for years. The air around the formation began to distort, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. In the dim light of my truck's parking lights, I saw a massive shape move through that distortion. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. The movement was fluid, almost graceful despite its size. It circled the formation exactly once, following the tracks from earlier, then seemed to fold into itself and vanish. When I finally worked up the courage to approach the site again, the crystal spiral was gone. Not scattered or disturbed, just gone. The footprints remained, but they were now filled with perfectly sized crystals, each one placed with the same precision as the spiral had been. The next day, I filed a detailed report with both the mining company and local authorities. They conducted a thorough investigation, but found no explanation for what happened. The footprints were photographed and measured by their teams, though their equipment seemed to work fine now. Soil samples were taken, and while they showed unusual compression patterns, there was nothing that could definitively explain what caused them. Over the next few weeks, we continued to experience equipment failures in that area of the pit. The metallic sounds would return occasionally, always at night, always in that same 3 quick, 2 slow pattern. But we never saw another crystal formation, or those enormous footprints again. I've worked that same mine for the past 7 years since this happened. While things have mostly returned to normal, there are still occasions when we'll find small clusters of crystals arranged in geometric patterns or hear those distinctive metallic sounds echoing from the deeper parts of the mine. The northwest section of the pit has never yielded the same quality of quartzite as it did before that day, almost like something changed in the geological makeup of the area. I know how this story sounds. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. I've spent countless hours trying to find rational explanations for what I saw that day. Was it an elaborate prank? Some kind of natural phenomenon we don't understand, or something else entirely. The only thing I know for certain is that whatever happened that October morning was real, and it fundamentally changed my understanding of what's possible. The footprints have long since eroded away, the crystal formations are locked in a company warehouse somewhere, and all the official reports probably gather dust in some filing cabinet. But that feeling, that moment of realizing I was in the presence of something completely beyond my understanding, that's never left me. Sometimes, especially on cold fall mornings when the air is crisp and clear, I'll catch a whiff of that musky, metallic smell, and every hair on my body will stand on end. I still work in that mine, but I never go to the northwest section alone anymore. And when we hear those metallic sounds echoing up from the depths, I can't help but wonder if whatever it was I encountered that day is still down there, arranging crystals in perfect patterns for reasons we may never understand.